You can run away from your past, but what happens when that past catches up to you right at the only door that could save you? Clara Whitmore has lost it all: her name, her family, her future. She wanders the Wyoming wilderness with only one last hope. But instead of finding salvation, she finds a dying child, a man on the verge of collapse, and a secret that could destroy everything she just dared to believe in. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe to my channel now. The horse gave out 3 miles east of Iron Ridge. Clara Whitmore didn't blame the animal. She'd pushed it too hard across 2 days of frozen ground, through wind that cut straight through her wool coat like it wasn't there, and the mare had been showing signs of strain since yesterday morning. Slowing her gait, tossing her head in that stiff, unhappy way that meant something was pulling wrong in a foreleg. Clara had ignored it longer than she should have. That was the truth of it. She'd been too focused on the horizon, on putting distance between herself and the last town, to pay proper attention to what was right beneath her. So when the mare finally stopped in the middle of a flat, snow-scraped stretch of open range and refused to take another step, Clara sat in the saddle for a long moment before she dismounted. She pressed her forehead against the animal's neck. The horse shuddered and exhaled a long, steaming breath. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. She unsaddled the mare and left her with what little grain remained in the saddlebag, loosening the cinch so the animal could rest properly. There was nothing else to do. She couldn't carry the horse. She could barely carry herself. Clara slung her saddlebag over one shoulder, wrapped her coat tighter across her chest, and started walking west into the wind. Wyoming in late October was not the kind of place that forgave poor decisions. The sky had been a flat, colorless gray for 4 days running, and the air carried that particular stillness that old-timers called the holding breath. The quiet before the first real snow of the season arrived in earnest. The grass was dead and bent low, flattened against the earth, and the few scrubby cottonwoods she passed looked skeletal against the pale sky. There were no sounds except the wind pushing through dry brush and the crunch of her own boots against the frozen ground. She'd left Crestfall 17 days ago. She didn't let herself think about Crestfall. She'd made that rule early, in the first week, when thinking about it had nearly cost her 2 days of travel, because she'd stopped walking and sat down on a rock for what felt like 10 minutes, but turned out to be closer to an hour, just sitting there in the cold while her body temperature dropped and her thoughts spiraled. After that, she'd made a firm internal decision. Crestfall didn't exist anymore. What happened there didn't exist anymore. There was only the next mile, and then the mile after that. She had 60 cents in her coat pocket, a half-empty canteen, a spare shirt, and a hunting knife that had belonged to her father. That was the total inventory of her life. She spotted the ranch as the light was beginning to go orange and thin in the west, maybe an hour before dark. It sat in a slight depression between 2 low ridges, sheltered on the north side by a stand of old pines. The main house was 2 stories, unpainted wood gone gray with weather, with a wide front porch and smoke rising from the chimney. There was a barn set back, and to the left, a smaller outbuilding beyond that, a fence line running south that she could see needed repair in at least 3 places from here. Cattle, maybe 20 head, stood bunched in the middle of the far field, their backs to the wind. It looked like a place that was holding on, but only just. Clara's lips were cracked and her feet had gone mostly numb in the last half mile. She needed water, and she needed to be out of the wind, and she knew she looked every bit as rough as she felt. The question of whether the people inside that house would open the door to her or run her off was something she'd think about when she got to it. She walked up the lane toward the house. She was 20 feet from the porch steps when she heard it. A baby crying. Not the fussing kind. The kind that babies did when they were hungry or tired or just wanted to be held. This was the other kind. The thin, exhausted kind, where the child had been crying long enough that the sound had lost its urgency and become something closer to a moan. Clara had heard it before once, when she was 12 years old and her neighbor's infant had gotten croup in January and nearly died before the doctor arrived. She hadn't forgotten the sound. It wasn't the kind of sound you forgot. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and listened. The crying continued, uninterrupted. No voice answering it, no footsteps inside moving toward it. She climbed the steps. She knocked on the door. Hard, 3 times, the kind of knock that meant she was serious about it. No answer. She tried the handle. The door opened. "Hello?" she called into the dim interior. Is somebody here? I heard a baby. The front room was a mess. Not the comfortable, lived-in kind of mess, but the kind that happened when someone stopped caring about the state of things. Dishes on the table from more than one meal, unwashed. A coat on the floor near the door where someone had dropped it and not picked it up. Ashes overflowed slightly from the fireplace hearth, though the fire itself was going, which was something. A child's sock on the chair near the window. The whole room smelled like unwashed dishes and wood smoke and something else underneath, like something medicinal, like camphor or vinegar. The crying was coming from upstairs. Clara set her saddlebag on the floor by the door and went to find it. The stairs creaked under her weight. At the top was a short hallway with 2 doors, both open. She went to the one on the right where the crying was coming from and pushed it open. A cradle sat near the window. Inside it, a baby. She looked to be maybe 5 or 6 months old, red-faced and sweating despite the chill in the room, working herself through the slow, mechanical cry of a child who had been at it for a long time. Clara crossed to the cradle and put her hand on the infant's forehead before she even thought about it. The baby was burning up. "Oh no," Clara said under her breath. She picked the child up. The infant, startled at the contact, went briefly quiet, then continued crying, but differently now, with more energy, like the presence of being held had given her something to cry against. Clara cradled the baby against her chest and looked around the room for clues. There was a small chest near the wall, and she opened it with one hand while holding the baby with the other and found clean cloths inside, a small glass bottle that was mostly empty, a rattle. Signs of a mother who had organized this room carefully sometime before. The arrangement was deliberate, everything in its place, but the cloth in the cradle itself was damp with the baby's sweat and hadn't been changed. Clara heard the front door below open and bang shut, heavy boots on the floorboards, then on the stairs, moving fast. The man who appeared in the doorway was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw full of several days' worth of stubble. He was wearing a coat still, like he'd just come in from outside, and he was carrying a small paper package in one hand. He stopped dead when he saw Clara standing in the middle of his daughter's room, holding his daughter. The look on his face went through about 4 different things in 2 seconds. Shock, suspicion, something like desperation. And then, surprisingly, the briefest flash of something that might have been relief before he locked it all back down behind a very careful expression. "Who the hell are you?" he said. His voice was not a small sound. It filled the room the way a larger man's voice might, controlled but with an edge underneath it that told Clara he wasn't a man who shouted often, which meant when he did, it counted. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, keeping her voice level. The baby was still crying against her shoulder. "My horse gave out on the East Road. I came to ask about water. I knocked, but nobody answered, and I could hear her. She's running a bad fever, sir. Has she had anything to drink in the last hour?" The man stared at her for a moment, and she could see him making calculations. Stranger in his house, holding his child. He didn't have much choice about being cautious, but the baby was crying, and she was clearly unwell, and there was a limit to how long a man could stand in the doorway, having feelings about a situation when the situation was actively in front of him. He crossed the room in 4 strides and took the baby from her. The child let out a louder protest at being transferred, then quieted slightly as the man pressed her against his chest and bent his head over her, checking her face, her forehead, with the automatic familiarity of someone who knew exactly what normal felt like on this particular child's skin. "Damn," he said quietly. Not at Clara, at the situation. "There's a cloth in that chest that ought to be wet with cool water and put on her neck," Clara said. "And she needs fluids if you can get them into her. She feels like she's been running that heat for a while." He looked up at her then. Something shifted in the evaluation he was doing. "You a nurse?" "No." "You got children of your own?" "No." "Then how do you—" "I've seen fever in children before," Clara said simply. "You do what you can with what you know." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back down at his daughter. "There's water in the kitchen," he said. "Pumps by the back door bring a cloth up wet. The cloths are in that chest." Clara took one of the cloths from the chest and went downstairs to the kitchen. His name was Elias Boone. She found this out approximately 30 minutes later, after the baby's fever had come down 2 degrees from the cool cloths and a few spoonfuls of water she'd managed to coax into the infant with a patience she hadn't known she still possessed. And after Elias Boone had stood over the cradle watching all of this with his arms crossed and his expression carefully unreadable, when he finally stepped back and let out a slow breath, he introduced himself. He didn't offer a handshake, and she didn't expect one. He just said his name and the baby's name, Rose, and then said, "Her mother died in August," in a voice that had no particular inflection, which somehow made it worse. "I'm sorry," Clara said. He nodded once, the way men did when they'd accepted condolences enough times that the mechanics of receiving them had gone mostly automatic. "Nora's in the barn," he said. "My daughter, 8 years old, she's been helping. But Rose has been sick before and she gets scared when it comes on, so she went to be with the horses. She does that sometimes." "Children find their own ways through things," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. It wasn't an unfriendly look, exactly, more like the look of someone recalibrating. "You want water," he said, "and you said your horse gave out. East of here, maybe 3 miles. She needs rest and probably some attention to her right foreleg. I left her with what grain I had." He rubbed the back of his neck. He hadn't taken his coat off yet, which told Clara he'd been in and out multiple times trying to manage whatever needed managing on a ranch in the late afternoon, and hadn't had a chance to stop. "I'll send someone out for the mare in the morning. Tonight you can stay in the barn if you need shelter." A beat. "Or there's a spare room on this floor. It's got a cot. It was my wife's sewing room." It was clearly not an easy offer to make. Clara could see that. He wasn't a man who invited strangers into his house freely, and the fact that he was making this offer at all told her something about how depleted things were here. He needed help. He probably couldn't bring himself to ask for it outright, so he was doing it sideways, 1 degree at a time. "I don't want to be in the way," Clara said carefully. "You're not in the way," he said. And then, like the words had cost him something, "She hasn't calmed down like that for anyone but my wife. Rose, it's been a hard few months." Clara looked at Rose in the cradle, the infant's breathing easier now, the red flush fading slightly from her cheeks. Then she looked at Elias Boone, still in his coat, with dark circles under his eyes, and 2 days of dirt on his hands that he hadn't had a moment to wash off. "I'll stay 1 night," she said. She told herself it was just the 1 night. She'd stayed 1 night in a lot of places that turned out to be something else entirely, and she knew better than to make promises about what came after. But 1 night she could commit to. 1 night didn't mean anything except that it was cold outside and there was a sick baby who needed watching, and she happened to be here. That was what she told herself. Nora Boone came in from the barn just before supper, smelled of horses and hay and cold air, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw Clara stirring the pot on the stove. She was a thin child with her father's dark hair, cut short in an uneven way that suggested someone, probably Elias, had done it themselves with less than ideal results. She had serious brown eyes that took in Clara with the frank, unimpressed assessment that only children and very old people could get away with. "Who are you?" Nora said. "Clara Whitmore. Your father said I could stay the night. My horse went lame." Nora considered this. "Is Rose okay?" "Her fever came down some. She's resting." Another long assessment. "You cook?" "I do." "Papa burns things," Nora said with the flat matter-of-factness of someone reporting a geological fact. "He burned the stew last Tuesday. We had to eat hardtack." "I don't burn things usually," Clara said. Nora crossed the kitchen, climbed onto the stool next to the counter, and picked up a potato. "I can peel these," she said. "I'd appreciate that." They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of the peeler against the potato and the low simmer of the pot. Clara was aware of the child watching her with those serious eyes from the corner of her vision, running some kind of interior evaluation. Kids did that. They were better at reading people than most adults gave them credit for. "You're not going to stay," Nora said finally. It wasn't a question. "Your father said 1 night." People always say 1 night. Nora put down the peeled potato and picked up another one. The last woman Papa asked to help came for 1 night and left before breakfast. The woman before her stayed 4 days and then said she had family obligations and left. She said this without apparent self-pity, just with the accuracy of a child who had learned to track these things carefully. Mama used to say people are who they are no matter what they tell you they are. Clara kept stirring the pot. Your mama sounds like she was a smart woman. She was, Nora said. She was quiet for a moment. She was also kind of bossy. Papa says that's where I get it from. She paused. He says it like a compliment. Clara looked over at her then, and Nora was looking at the potato she was peeling with an expression that was working very hard at being neutral and not entirely succeeding. Clara turned back to the stove. What's for supper? Nora said, in the tone of someone deliberately changing the subject. Beef stew if I can get it right with what's in your larder. We're low on things. Papa hasn't gone to Hardwick in a while. I noticed. I think I can make it work. By the time Elias came in from doing the last of the evening chores, the kitchen smelled like something actually edible, which Clara could tell from his expression was not the current norm. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in the coat, and looked at the pot on the stove, and then at Clara, and then at Nora, who was setting the table with the focused concentration of a child carrying out an important mission. Rose is still sleeping, Clara said. I checked her 20 minutes ago. Temperature's holding steady, maybe a little lower. If she stays like that through the night, she should be past the worst of it by morning. Elias absorbed this. Thank you, he said. He said it like a man who meant it very specifically and wasn't going to dress it up with anything extra. Sit down, Clara said. Both of you. Let's eat while it's hot. She'd planned to lie awake in the sewing room thinking through her situation. The mare, the state of her finances, the question of where she was headed and whether there was anything actually waiting at the end of whatever road she was traveling. These were the things she normally thought about in the small hours, turning them over like stones, looking at what was underneath. Instead, she fell asleep within 10 minutes on the narrow cot and slept the first deep, unbroken sleep she'd had since leaving Crestfall. She woke before dawn to the sound of Rose crying again. Clara was on her feet and halfway up the stairs before she was fully awake. When she pushed open the door to the nursery, Elias was already there, crouched next to the cradle in the dark, trying to figure out whether the baby was hungry or in pain or just unhappy about something. He looked up when Clara came in. I think she's hungry, Clara said, reading the quality of the cry. And cold. Can you bank the fire in here? I'll see about getting something warm into her. He didn't question it. He went to the fireplace and she took Rose from the cradle and went to the kitchen. She was still there, rocking the baby in the chair by the kitchen stove, which was the warmest place in the house, when the gray light of early morning started showing at the windows. Rose had taken a little milk, heated slow and careful, and had settled into the particular boneless sleep of a very young child who had finally gotten what it needed. Clara was tired enough that her eyes burned, but she didn't move. The baby was warm and sleeping, and Clara had nowhere else to be. Elias found her there at first light. He leaned in the kitchen doorway and looked at them for a long moment. You stayed up, he said. She needed someone. I could have. You were already up with her half the night, Clara said. Let someone else carry a piece of it. He was quiet. Outside, the first birds were starting up somewhere, though it was too cold for many of them. Clara could hear the cattle shifting in the field. A day starting up on a ranch did that. Began announcing itself before the sun was even properly there, sounds layering on sounds until the whole thing was awake, whether you wanted it to be or not. You said one night, Elias said. I did. Another silence. Rose likes you, he said. It came out almost reluctantly, like a piece of evidence he hadn't wanted to present, but had decided was material to the case. She's been difficult with people. Since Margaret died, it's not her fault, he added quickly. She's just a baby. She doesn't understand any of it. But she's been fussy with everyone who tries to... He stopped, started again. The woman I hired in September quit after 5 days because Rose cried every time she picked her up. Clara looked down at the baby in her arms, who was sleeping with the focused abandon of the very young, one small fist pressed against her own cheek. She just needed someone to sit with her through it, Clara said. That's all. Sometimes that's what people need too. Elias looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then in the end, at Clara. I can't pay much, he said. I'll be honest with you about that. The ranch is It's not what it was. I can offer room, board, and what little cash I have available until the cattle go in spring. That's the truth of it. Clara thought about the 60 cents in her coat pocket. She thought about the road she'd been walking for 17 days, the nothing ahead of it, the nothing behind. She thought about the way Nora Boone had said, people are who they are no matter what they tell you they are. With the precision of a child who had already learned this lesson younger than she should have had to. She thought about Crestfall and what had happened there, and the fact that it would follow her, that it always followed her, that no amount of miles had proven sufficient to put it away for good. She could keep walking. She'd gotten very good at walking. And at some point she would arrive at another town and another set of eyes that would figure out who she was and what people said about her, and she would have to leave again and then again after that. Room and board will do, Clara said. For now. Elias Boone nodded once, the same careful nod as before. But something in his face had shifted. Barely, just at the edges, but Clara had gotten very good at reading small changes in people's faces. It looked almost like something coming loose that had been held too tight for too long. The first week was mostly about logistics. That was how Clara managed it, kept herself focused on the concrete, the measurable, the tasks that needed doing regardless of how she felt about them. The larder was worse than low. It was nearly bare in some essential categories. There was some dried beef and a diminishing supply of cornmeal and a few things put up in jars that someone, Margaret Boone clearly, had preserved the previous summer, but the organization had slipped badly and some of the jars had gone wrong without anyone noticing. Clara went through everything methodically, making a list on a scrap of brown paper she found in the kitchen. The list was long. Elias looked at it and set his jaw in a way that told her the money was tight enough that even this was going to require calculation. I'll take it to Hardwick at the end of the week, he said, when I see about the cattle count. Some of this can wait, Clara said. Some of it can't. She'd separated the list into 2 columns. The things that couldn't wait were shorter, and she'd kept them to the cheapest practical options. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was trying to solve the problem. He looked at the 2 columns. His expression did the thing again. That small shift, the loosening. You've managed a household before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Clara said. She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. That was how it went at first. He didn't ask, and she didn't explain, and they occupied the ranch the way 2 people might occupy a shared workspace where the division of labor was still being negotiated, circling around each other's roles, picking up tasks that needed doing, occasionally arriving at the same task simultaneously, and having to wordlessly agree on who would take it. He was not an easy man to read, Elias Boone. He was quiet in the way that some men were. Not from shyness, she didn't think, but from habit, from the kind of life that didn't have a lot of room for talking when there was work to be done. He said what he meant when he said something, without ornamentation, and he noticed things without always commenting on them. She found this easier to navigate than a man who talked too much. Nora was a different kind of company. Nora talked at roughly the pace of a river after heavy rain, steadily, with occasional bursts of acceleration, and had opinions about a staggering number of things. She had opinions about the proper way to muck out a stall. She had opinions about which of the 3 cats who lived in the barn were actually useful versus decorative. She had strong and clearly long-considered opinions about the limited menu available at the school in Hardwick and the personal failings of several of her classmates, described with the surgical precision of a child who had been paying very close attention for 8 years. Clara let Nora talk. She listened, which was apparently different from what Nora was used to, because after about the 3rd day, the girl started looking at Clara during her longer monologues with something approaching suspicion, like she was waiting to be interrupted or dismissed. When she wasn't, the suspicion gradually softened into something that hadn't quite made up its mind yet about what it wanted to be. Baby Rose was not simple. She had the particular stubbornness of a very young child who had already figured out that the world was less reliable than it had previously appeared to be and was not going to let her guard down easily. She slept in fits, woke at irregular hours, refused food sometimes, and then demanded it at inconvenient moments. Her temperature fluctuated in ways that kept Clara watchful through the first week, never spiking the way it had when Clara arrived, but never fully settling either, just hovering in a range that was worrying enough to pay attention to. Clara gave her a lot of what she'd given her that first night. presence, patience. The willingness to just be there at 2 in the morning when the baby woke crying and needed someone to rock her back down. Elias would appear in the nursery doorway sometimes on those nights, hair in disarray, and find Clara already there. He would stand in the doorway for a moment. "Go back to sleep," Clara told him the first time. "I've got her." "You need sleep too." "I'll sleep in the morning. She'll sleep longer in the morning. We'll work it out." He stood there another moment, visibly running some interior argument, and then went back to his room. This became a pattern. Clara thought it probably bothered him more than he let on. The loss of control, or the debt of it, or both. But he was practical enough to accept what was being offered when the alternative was everyone being exhausted all the time. Rose's fever broke completely on the 9th day. Clara knew it before she even checked the baby's forehead. Something in the quality of the morning cry, fuller, more demanding, less that worrying thin edge, telling her before her hand confirmed it. She stood in the nursery and let out a long, slow breath. Nora appeared at the nursery door, still in her nightgown, her dark hair sticking up on one side. She looked at Clara's face and read something there. "She's better?" Nora said. "Better," Clara confirmed. Nora stood there for a moment. Then she crossed the room and pressed her face briefly into Clara's side. Not a hug exactly, more the movement of a child checking whether a solid thing is as solid as it looks. And then stepped back. "Good," she said, with great seriousness. "Yes," Clara said. "Good." She hadn't told them anything about Crestfall. She hadn't told them anything about herself beyond the basic facts. Her name, her origin. She said Eastern Wyoming, which was technically true. The fact that she'd been traveling and working where she could. Elias hadn't pressed. It wasn't his way to press about things that weren't his immediate business, and she appreciated that, even as she knew it was only a matter of time before the information would become his business, whether either of them wanted it to. She was aware, every day, of the borrowed nature of this piece. That was the word she kept coming back to. Borrowed. The days here on Iron Ridge had a quality to them that she didn't want to name too directly. A settledness, an order to things, a sense of something actually working, that felt like credit extended against a debt she was eventually going to have to settle. Crestfall would come to Iron Ridge eventually. It always did. The story about Clara Whitmore had a way of traveling, the way all stories did in ranch country, passed from one set of ears to another, along the freight lines and the postal routes and the idle talk at general stores. It might arrive in a letter. It might arrive in a stranger's face, that moment of recognition she'd learned to dread. It might arrive in whatever form it chose. She didn't know exactly when. She only knew it was coming. On the evening of the 14th day, she was in the kitchen finishing up after supper when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard. Not Elias. He was in the barn. She could see the lamp there through the kitchen window. A visitor. She moved to the window and saw a man on a big gray horse, dismounting at the fence with the unhurried ease of someone who considered this his regular right. She couldn't see his face clearly in the fading light, but something about the way he moved, the way he took in the house and the yard and the state of things with a slow, comprehensive look, like a man taking inventory, made the skin on the back of her neck go slightly cold. She watched him go to the barn. She watched the two men emerge from it a few minutes later, talking. Even from this distance, she could see the resemblance. The same height, the same way of standing, though this man was broader through the shoulders and maybe a decade older. He was gesturing toward the house, and Elias was listening with his arms crossed. Then the visitor turned and looked directly at the kitchen window. Clara didn't move. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't read at this distance, then turned back to Elias and said something else. Elias went still. Clara took a step back from the window and stood in the middle of the kitchen, keeping her face neutral, listening to Rose sleeping in the room above and Nora's voice upstairs. The child had taken to reading aloud to herself in the evenings, a habit Clara found she liked. And the sound of two men's voices in the yard below, getting closer now. She had known it was coming, she just hadn't expected it quite this soon. The front door opened and Elias came in, and behind him came the man from the yard. His face fully visible now in the lamplight, older than Elias by 10 years, with gray at his temples and a jaw that had probably once looked like Elias's, and now looked harder, more settled into itself. He looked at Clara standing in the kitchen doorway, and Clara watched his face change. The change wasn't explosive. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. The kind of recognition that moved through a person like cold water, certainty replacing everything else. "Silas," Elias said, "this is Clara Whitmore. She's been helping out with Rose and the—" "I know who she is," Silas Boone said. His voice was calm. That was what made it bad. He wasn't shouting. He was just stating a fact in the voice of a man who was certain of his facts. He looked at his brother. "Elias, we need to talk." Elias looked at Clara. She kept her expression exactly as still as she could manage, though her heart had taken on a particular quality of beat, not fast, just very deliberate, like it was making sure she felt each one. This was the moment she'd been walking away from for 17 days. It had waited patiently and found her anyway, the way these things always did. It was here now. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Whitmore was not sure she was going to run. Silas Boone was not the kind of man who softened things. Elias figured that out about his brother early, maybe when they were boys, maybe even before that, in whatever arrangement of temperament and circumstance produced a man like Silas. He said what he thought, and he thought it was a virtue, and in many cases it was. Silas had built his own spread 40 miles north of Iron Ridge through a combination of hard work and the willingness to call situations what they were without dressing them up. Clara had met men like that before. She'd learned that their directness was real, but that it was also sometimes a substitute for nuance, for the kind of thinking that took longer and was less satisfying to express. Elias looked at his brother and then at Clara, and Clara watched him try to calculate how to handle the next 10 minutes. "Whatever it is," Elias said carefully, "say it." Silas hadn't taken his eyes off Clara. "You know what people say about her?" "I don't know anything about her except that she's been here 2 weeks and my daughter is sleeping through the night and Rose's fever broke 4 days ago and supper has been hot every evening," Elias said. "So, no. Tell me what people say." "She was run out of Crestfall," Silas said. He said it the way you'd say a thing you expected to settle a matter. "There was a man, a married man, a banker named Holt Deering. His wife found letters, Clara's letters to him. They were specific, and when it came out, Deering's wife made sure everyone in 3 counties knew the whole story." He paused, let that sit. There were other things people said after, about her conduct generally. "I heard it from the Kemper brothers who do business out of Crestfall, and they heard it from people who were there." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara could hear the lamp on the table humming faintly, and upstairs Nora had gone silent, which meant she was probably listening through the floor. Elias looked at Clara. Not like he was already deciding, but like he was waiting. There was a difference. "I'm not going to tell you that story isn't out there," Clara said. She kept her voice even. "I'm not going to tell you nothing happened." "Then what are you going to tell me?" Silas said. "I'm going to tell you that what you heard is about 1/3 of what actually occurred, and that the 1/3 people chose to repeat was selected for maximum damage." She looked at Silas directly. "And I'm going to tell you I'm not having this conversation tonight, standing in a kitchen after 14 days of work that speaks for itself." Silas's jaw tightened. "That's not a denial." It's not," Clara agreed. "It's also not a confession. And until you're interested in hearing the actual story, instead of the one you already decided on, there's not much more I can say that would be useful to either of us." She turned and went up the stairs, not quickly, not like she was fleeing, just like she was done with the conversation. She sat on the cot in the sewing room and listened to the murmur of voices below. Elias and Silas, too low to make out the words, which was probably deliberate. And she put her hands flat on her knees and breathed slowly through her nose the way she'd learned to do when the situation required stillness instead of motion. She expected to hear Elias's boots on the stairs within 20 minutes, telling her politely that she needed to move on in the morning. The boots came up the stairs at around 11 o'clock. After Silas had gone out to the barn to sleep, she'd heard the barn door, and the house had been quiet for almost an hour. She heard Elias pause in the hallway outside the sewing room door, and she sat up straight on the cot in the dark and waited. He knocked once. "Come in," she said. He opened the door but didn't come in, just stood in the doorway with the lamp from the hallway behind him so she couldn't see his face clearly. He was quiet for a moment in the way he had, that settling into things quiet, finding the right entry point. Silas will want you gone in the morning, he said. I know. He doesn't speak for this ranch. A beat. I want to be clear about that. Clara waited. I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me, Elias said. That's your business, not mine. What's my business is what I've seen here for 2 weeks, which is a person who showed up when things were bad and made them better, and didn't ask for credit and didn't make it complicated. He stopped, seemed to assess whether he'd said the thing correctly. I don't think you need to leave. That's what I came to say. Clara looked at him in the dark doorway. Your brother is going to be a problem. Yes, Elias agreed, with the weariness of a man who had spent a lifetime being aware of this. And whatever he told you about Crestfall, I didn't ask you to explain it, he said again, gently but firmly, like a door being closed. Not shut, just pulled to. When you're ready to say something, say it. I'll listen. Until then, it's none of my concern. Clara sat with that for a moment. It was a strange thing to be offered, in her experience. Most people wanted the explanation up front, wanted to weigh it and file it before they decided how to proceed. Elias Boone was apparently built differently. All right, she said. He nodded, the lamplight catching the side of his face just enough that she could see he meant what he'd said, that it wasn't performance. Then he pulled the door closed and she heard him go back down the hallway to his own room. She lay back on the cot in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Running, she thought, was the thing she knew how to do. She'd gotten very good at it. She could be packed and out the door before dawn, retrieve the mare, and be gone before Silas Boone opened his eyes in the morning. She could be 20 miles from here by noon, 40 miles by dark, and this would become one more place she'd been and left. One more set of faces that would eventually fade. She knew the shape of that choice. She'd made it enough times that it fit like something worn in. The other choice, staying, standing still, letting Silas's judgment land and not running from it, that shape was less familiar. That shape had edges she didn't entirely know the feel of yet. But she thought about Nora, who had looked at her this afternoon with something in her face that she'd worked very hard not to attach too much meaning to. And she thought about Rose, asleep upstairs, who still startled awake twice a night and settled faster if Clara was the one who went to her. And she thought about Elias in the doorway just now, saying, I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me in the voice of a man who meant it. She closed her eyes. She didn't run. Morning came gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, and Clara was in the kitchen making coffee when Silas came in from the barn. He stopped when he saw her. She poured a second cup without being asked and set it on the table and kept her back to him while she stirred the oats on the stove. He stood there long enough that she thought maybe he'd turn around and leave. Then she heard the scrape of the chair and the small sound of him sitting down. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The oats simmered and the coffee steamed, and somewhere upstairs Rose made the preliminary sounds of a baby working up to waking, and after about 5 minutes of this, Silas picked up the coffee cup. This going to be awkward every morning? He said. That's up to you, Clara said. He made a sound that might have been a grunt or might have been a laugh, the way some men combine those two things. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Someone who'd start crying, or start arguing, or pack up in the night and be gone before I came in. He wrapped both hands around the cup. That's what usually happens when someone gets told what you got told last night. I've been told it before, Clara said. I know what it sounds like. Silas was quiet. She turned around and looked at him across the kitchen. He was a harder-faced version of Elias, this man, the same bones but with more years and more weather pressed into them, and a set to his mouth that came from having made a lot of decisions and lived with them. I'm not going to pretend I don't have concerns, he said. Good, I wouldn't trust it if you did. But Elias is a grown man who runs his own ranch. He said this like it cost him something, the admission. And Margaret's been gone 3 months, and this place was starting to come apart at the seams. His eyes moved around the kitchen, taking in what was different from when he'd presumably last been here. The organized larder, the clean surfaces, the systematic order of things. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut and watch, for now. I can live with that, Clara said. Don't make me regret it, he said. Not as a threat exactly, more as a man stating his terms. I'm not trying to make anyone regret anything, Clara said. I'm trying to get your nieces through the winter. Something moved through his expression. Brief, unguarded. He looked back down at his coffee. Rose looks better, he said gruffly. She is better. Good. He cleared his throat. I'll be here 2 weeks. Came to help with the fence line on the south pasture before the ground freezes solid. If you need things from Hardwick, I'll go with Elias at the end of the week. I have a list, Clara said. I'll bet you do, Silas said. And there it was again. That sound that was half grunt and half something else. The 2 weeks with Silas in the house were not easy, but they were not what she'd feared either. He watched her the way he'd said he would, steadily, without making it obvious. The way a man checked a fence line for weak spots, not because he expected it to fall, but because he'd been around long enough to know that the ones you didn't check were the ones that went down. Clara felt his attention the way you felt a draft in a room. Not unpleasant, just present, reminding you it was there. She went about her work. The ranch needed more than she'd initially assessed. The south pasture fence was one thing, and the two men worked on it through the cold afternoons, their breath making clouds in the air. But the inside of the house had its own deferred maintenance, not structural, but the kind that accumulated when a person was grieving and surviving and not quite managing both at once. Hinges that needed oil. A window in the back bedroom that didn't sit right in its frame and let cold air in around the edge. Shelves in the larder that had warped for moisture and needed reseating. Clara worked through these things methodically, one at a time, in the hours when Rose was sleeping and Nora was at school and the men were outside. She wasn't performing industry for Silas's benefit. She was doing it because it needed doing, and because she had a use for keeping her hands occupied. Nora came home from school on the third day after Silas arrived and found Clara on a step stool in the back bedroom, working a thin cloth soaked in linseed oil along the edge of the problematic window frame. Silas doesn't like you, Nora announced, dropping her school bag on the floor. He doesn't know me, Clara said. There's a difference. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most propositions. Is it because of what happened in Crestfall? Clara came down off the step stool slowly. She looked at Nora. How do you know about Crestfall? I wasn't asleep, Nora said without apology. The floor's thin. Clara exhaled through her nose. Yes, that's part of it. What happened there? That's a long story for another time. I'm 8, Nora said. I can handle things. I know you can, Clara said, but it's a complicated story, and I need to think about how to tell it properly. Can you give me that? Nora looked at her with those serious brown eyes for a long moment, doing some kind of interior assessment. Then, okay, but you have to actually tell me someday, not just say you will and then not. I'll tell you, Clara said. I promise. Nora picked up her school bag. At the door she paused. Silas is watching you all the time, she said, but I don't think he looks like someone who's decided yet. He looks like someone still deciding. That's more than I expected, Clara said. Me too, Nora admitted and went downstairs. The thing about rebuilding a place, and Clara understood this in a bone-deep way she'd never quite put words to, was that it happened in layers you couldn't always see while they were happening. You fixed one thing and something else that had been propped up against it settled wrong, and then you fixed that. And slowly, underneath all of it, the whole structure found a new balance. The balance wasn't perfect. It wasn't what it had been before, but it was real, and it held weight. Iron Ridge Ranch was like that. The fence line on the south pasture took Elias and Silas 5 days of cold work, and when they finished it, the cattle in that field moved differently, Clara thought. Or maybe she was reading too much into it, but they seemed less bunched and anxious, spreading out the way animals did when they felt the boundary of their territory was secure. The larder, reorganized and restocked after the trip to Hardwick, made Elias's evenings measurably less strained. She could see it in the way he sat at the kitchen table after supper, the set of his shoulders slightly lower than it had been. Nora started sleeping better once Rose did, the way children in the same household calibrated to each other in ways the adults around them didn't always notice. Small things, but small things added up. One evening, near the end of Silas's second week, Claire was putting Rose down for the night and heard the two brothers talking in the kitchen below. The low, steady murmur of a conversation that had been going for a while. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the quality of it, the rhythm, and it sounded like the kind of talking that men did when they were actually saying things rather than exchanging information. She hadn't heard Elias talk like that in the weeks she'd been here. He was generally a man of short, functional sentences, at least with people he didn't know well. She got Rose settled and stood in the nursery for a moment, in the dark, listening to the quiet house around her. The fire in the nursery popping softly, Nora's breathing from the room next door, deep and even. The voice of the wind outside picking up. It had been building all day, and the temperature had dropped hard in the last hour. She'd noticed it when she'd gone to the well before supper. There was a particular quality to the cold now, heavier than it had been, a weight in the air that the old-timers would have read as the season shifting into its serious phase. She went downstairs. The brothers looked up when she came into the kitchen. Silas had his hands around a coffee cup, and Elias was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. And they had the look of men who'd been talking long enough that the conversation had found a natural resting point. Temperature dropped, Clara said. Fast, in the last hour. Elias straightened slightly. How bad? I don't know yet, but the air feels like it did before the early snow 2 years ago. She stopped, realizing she'd said it before she'd thought about whether to say it. Before I left Crestfall. We had an early storm. Neither man said anything about Crestfall. Elias stood up from the table and went to the back door, opened it, and stood looking out for a moment. The wind pushed into the kitchen, cold enough that Clara felt it from across the room. He came back in and closed the door. He and Silas exchanged a look. Cattle need checking, Silas said. And the barn, Elias said. If this gets bad. I'll see to the cattle, Silas said, already reaching for his coat. He looked at Clara as he stood. You got enough wood brought in? I brought an extra armload before supper, she said. I can bring more. Silas nodded. There was something different in the nod than there had been the first morning. Still measured, still reserved, but without the assessment quality it had carried then. He was past the stage of watching to see what she would do. He'd watched. He'd seen. He went out into the building, dark, and the wind. Elias stayed in the kitchen for a moment. He was looking at the door Silas had just gone through, but not like he was thinking about the door. He's not a bad man, Elias said. Not defensively, just accurately. He learned to be careful about people the hard way, and it stuck. I know that kind, Clara said. Elias glanced at her. Yeah, he said quietly. I think maybe you do. Silas left on a Thursday morning with the sky clear and cold and the wind having spent itself overnight. He loaded his horse with the same efficiency he'd brought to everything else and said his goodbyes to Nora, who received his departure with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who was used to people coming and going. He kissed Rose on the top of her head with a tenderness that seemed to surprise him slightly, like he'd done it before he'd decided whether to. He stopped at the porch steps where Clara was standing. You're not who I thought you were, he said. He said it like a concession, or the closest thing to one a man like Silas was constitutionally capable of. I know what you thought, Clara said. I still want to hear the truth about Crestfall someday, he said. Not because I'm looking for more to hold against you, because I was ready to run you off based on something I heard secondhand, and I'd like to know how wrong I was. Someday, Clara said. Maybe. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something adjacent to one. Fair enough, he said. He mounted up and rode north. Clara watched him go until he was small against the flat gray sky, and then turned back into the house. November settled over Iron Ridge the way real winter always did. Not dramatically, but with the steady, relentless insistence of something that didn't have anywhere else to be. The days shortened and the temperature stopped going above freezing reliably, and the work on the ranch contracted inward, the way life did in cold months, pulling everything closer to the fire and the walls. Clara found a rhythm to the days that she hadn't expected to find. Not the rhythm of a temporary arrangement that had a different feel, always slightly provisional, always with the awareness that it could end. This felt different. It felt like the rhythm of a place. She understood this was dangerous. She understood the precise way in which it was dangerous, because she'd been in borrowed places before, and she knew what it felt like when the borrowing period ended. She tried to stay aware of the temporary nature of things. But awareness, she was discovering, didn't entirely protect you from the thing you were aware of. Elias was... She had to be careful about how she let herself think about Elias. He was a man doing his best under circumstances that would have broken a lot of people, and he was doing it with less grace than he probably would have managed under normal conditions because grief did that to a person. Stripped off the outer layers and left you working with just the core of yourself, whatever that turned out to be. His core was decent. She could see that clearly. He was not charming, and he was not polished, and he sometimes said the wrong thing because he was saying what was in his head without the filter that more socially comfortable men would have applied. And she found this, against what she would have expected, a relief. He trusted her with the ranch in a way that built gradually and that she didn't think he was entirely aware of doing. He started consulting her without framing it as consultation, coming in from the fields and saying things like, "The Hendersons offered to buy 3 of the yearling steers at the end of the month. You think that's the right time to sell?" And then actually listening to what she said, not the way men sometimes listen to women, with the listening expression on and the ignoring underneath, but the actual way, where the answer fed into whatever calculation he was already running. She didn't know what to do with this, so she did nothing with it except go on being useful, which was the only thing she was certain she knew how to do reliably. One afternoon in late November, she was in the kitchen working on the week's bread, a task that required time and repetition and gave her mind room to move. When Nora came and sat at the table and didn't say anything for an unusually long time, which meant she was building up to something. "What is it?" Clara said without turning around. "How did you know I was going to say something?" "You sit different when you're thinking about saying something." Nora absorbed this information about herself with interest. "What do I do?" "You fold your hands on the table and look at them." Nora looked at her hands, then quickly unfolded them. "I have a question." "All right. Are you going to leave in the spring?" Clara turned around and looked at her. Nora was looking at her with that direct, measuring gaze, and there was something underneath it that was trying to pretend it wasn't there. A vulnerability that the child was doing her best to keep at arm's length. Clara set down the bread she was working and came to the table. She sat down across from Nora. "I don't know what spring looks like yet," she said honestly. "I'm not going to pretend I do." "That's not the same as no," Nora said. "It's not," Clara agreed. "But it's not the same as yes either." Nora was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "I know Papa wouldn't ask you to stay," she said carefully. "He wouldn't ask anybody for anything he thought was too much. It's a thing he does." "I know," Clara said, "so I'm asking, because I'm 8 and apparently I can get away with it." She met Clara's eyes steadily. "Don't leave, okay? Don't just leave. If you have to go, tell us first." Clara felt something shift behind her sternum, some internal structure settling differently. "Okay," she said. "Promise?" "Yes," Clara said. "I promise." Nora unfolded her hands and went back to looking at the table, apparently satisfied. Then she looked up again, businesslike. "Can I help with the bread?" "Get your hands washed first." December arrived with 2 days of serious cold that pushed everything below zero and kept them largely inside. On the 3rd day, the temperature came back up enough to work outside, and Elias spent the afternoon checking the cattle and came in at dusk with a look on his face that told Clara something was wrong before he said a word. He sat down at the table and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man clearing his head, and then looked up. "Lost a steer," he said. "One of the older ones. Found him out by the east fence." He paused. It's not catastrophic, but it's not nothing. We were counting on him going to the Henderson sale in spring." "How much does that cost you?" Clara said. He told her, and she did the math quietly in her head. It was a significant number for a ranch operating on Iron Ridge's current margins. "The yearlings," she said. "The 2 heifers you were thinking of keeping back. If the winter stays hard, is it worth it to hold them?" He looked at her. "You mean sell them early?" "I mean talk to Henderson now before the market drops further and see what he'll offer. You have leverage right now that you won't have in March when everyone's selling." He was quiet. She could see him running numbers internally, checking them against things she didn't know about. The specifics of his agreements, the state of the herd she hadn't fully assessed, the details of his finances that he kept close. He didn't share everything with her, and she didn't expect him to. "That's not a bad idea," he said finally. It might be wrong, she said. I don't know the full picture. No, he said. It's... I'd been thinking something like it, and hadn't wanted to admit it was the right move. He looked at her with a kind of straightforwardness she'd come to recognize, the kind that didn't come with warmth attached, but somehow conveyed it anyway. Thank you. Don't thank me until it works, Clara said. He almost smiled. You know, Silas told me before he left. He stopped. What? He shook his head slightly, like he'd decided not to say it. Nothing that matters now. He stood up from the table, and for a moment he was close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face that was always there, deep-set and constant, the kind that came from the accumulation of months rather than the events of a single day. Then he stepped back. Supper in an hour? An hour, she confirmed. He went to change out of his cold weather gear, and Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the wind starting up again outside, and thought about the way the ranch was changing by degrees, and how she was changing along with it, and whether there was any useful purpose served by continuing to pretend that this was still just one night extended from one night into the next. She was still thinking about it when, 3 days later, the snow started falling. It was not a normal snowfall. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and watched it come in from the northwest with the low, dark sky behind it, and she felt something she'd felt once before, that particular atmospheric pressure that meant the storm had depth to it, that it was not going to come through quickly and move on. She went to the larder and took stock. Then she went upstairs and checked Rose, who was sleeping, and then she went to the barn to find Elias. He was already there, forking hay to the horses with the urgency of a man who had seen the sky. "How bad do you think?" he said when he heard her come in. "Bad," she said. "The kind that stays." He stopped forking hay and stood for a moment looking at the barn wall like he was looking through it at the sky. His jaw was tight. "Rose," he said. "Sleeping. She's been good for 4 days." Clara paused. "Elias." "She's been good." He nodded. But there was something in his face that she recognized from the early days. That helpless vigil quality, the fear that sat underneath everything when you had a child who had already been sick once this season and the weather was about to close everything down. "We'll watch her," Clara said, "both of us. She'll be okay." He looked at her then, directly, the way he didn't always. There was something in it that she didn't try to name, just let sit in the air between them. "All right," he said. And then the storm hit in earnest. The storm came in 3 waves. The first was wind, pure wind, arriving before the snow, announcing itself by taking the barn door off its upper hinge sometime in the small hours of the first night, and slamming it against the outer wall with a sound like a rifle shot. Clara was awake before the echo died. She heard Elias already moving in his room down the hall, boots hitting the floor, and by the time she had her coat on, he was at the bottom of the stairs heading for the door. "Stay in," he said without looking back. "The door needs 2 people," she said. He didn't argue. He just pushed out into the dark and she went after him. The cold hit her like something physical, not wind chill, not discomfort, but actual force. A wall of it that pushed against her chest and made breathing a conscious act. She tucked her chin down and followed Elias across the yard, which was already drifted against the fence posts on the north side. The snow was horizontal, driven so hard it felt like sand against any exposed skin. They got the barn door back on its hinge with difficulty. The hinge had bent, and the door kept wanting to swing away before they could seat it properly. Elias held it with his body while Clara worked the pin, her fingers going stupid with cold inside her gloves. It took 4 attempts. When it finally seated, both of them leaned against the door in the relative shelter of the barn entrance and just breathed for a moment. Inside the barn, the horses were moving in their stalls, uneasy with the sound of the storm on the roof. A constant roar that made conversation difficult even in here. The cattle in the field would have to take shelter where they could. There was nothing to be done about that in this. "Go back in," Elias said. His face was reddened from the cold, snow melt running down from his hairline. "Check Rose." Clara went back. Rose was awake when she got upstairs, not crying, just lying in the cradle with her eyes open and her fists moving the way infants' fists moved when they were processing the world. Clara put her hand on the baby's forehead out of pure reflex, the way she'd done dozens of times over the past weeks. She stood very still. Then she checked again, pressing the back of her wrist against the baby's forehead, then her cheek. Rose was warm. Not the warmth of a sleeping baby in a warm room, the other kind. Clara picked her up and held her against her neck and felt the heat radiating through the child's sleep suit, and her stomach dropped with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "No," she said quietly, to no one in particular, to the situation itself. "Not now." She carried Rose to the kitchen and got the lamp going and checked her properly in the light. The baby's color was off, flushed across the cheeks in the particular way that had preceded the last fever. And her eyes had that slightly glassy quality that Clara had learned to recognize as the early warning. Not the peak yet, the beginning. Elias came back in from the barn 15 minutes later, snow still on his coat, and read Clara's face before she said a word. "How bad?" he said. "Early. I caught it early." She kept her voice steady because the alternative wasn't useful. "But the storm is only going to get worse, and if it follows the same pattern as before—" "It won't be the same as before," he said. He crossed the kitchen and put his own hand on Rose's forehead and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed, which was such a naked, unguarded gesture that Clara looked away to give him the privacy of it. "The last time got bad fast." "I know." "We need a doctor." "I know." "Hardwick is 20 miles. "I know, Elias." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Then he looked at the window, which was white with driven snow. The wind on the roof was so loud it had become its own kind of silence, a constant pressure that replaced quiet rather than interrupting it. "I can write it," he said. Clara looked at him. She understood immediately that this was not impulsiveness. He'd done the calculation the same way she had, she could see it in his face, and arrived at the same ugly conclusion. The storm was getting worse, not better. By tomorrow morning it would be impassable. Tonight, in the dark, in this, it was barely possible. Barely was the operative word. "Elias, she almost died last time," he said quietly, "before you came. She got that bad and I didn't know what to do, and I can't watch that happen again, and no, I didn't try." He said it without drama, just stating the truth of the thing. "You can manage the fever until the doctor gets here. You know how." "What if you don't make it?" Clara said. She said it directly because they were past the point where softening things was useful. 20 miles in this in the dark. "Then I don't make it," he said, with a flatness that was worse than if he'd been afraid. "But Rose does. You'll see to that." Clara stood in the kitchen holding a feverish baby and looked at this man in his snow-wet coat and understood something she hadn't let herself look at directly before, that he was not holding together as well as she'd thought. That what she'd read as stability was in large part structure, the scaffolding of routine and responsibility, and underneath it was someone who was genuinely terrified of losing something else. Someone who had already lost too much to be rational about the risk calculus. "Take the gray horse," she said. "He's steadier in weather. And take the rope from the tack room. If visibility drops, you'll need a tether point." He was already moving toward the door. "Keep her cool, the cloths." "I know what to do," Clara said. "Go." He went. The storm got worse at around 3 in the morning. Clara knew this not by looking outside. The windows were entirely white by then, a solid moving curtain that made the world beyond the glass invisible. But by the sound of it, the roar on the roof changed pitch, deepening into something that felt less like weather and more like intention, the kind of sound that made you aware in a primitive way that you were inside a structure and structures had limits. She was in the kitchen, which she'd chosen for the warmth of the stove, with Rose in her arms and Nora asleep on the bench along the wall. The girl had come downstairs at midnight, sleep-creased and serious, and said, "Is Papa back?" And when Clara said no, she'd simply sat down on the bench and wrapped herself in the blanket Clara handed her and stayed. Clara hadn't sent her back up. There was something right about the company, even if one of them was 8 years old and neither of them could do anything except wait. Rose's fever had peaked somewhere around 1 in the morning, and Clara had fought it with everything she had. Cool cloths on the neck and wrists, the small spoonful amounts of water every 20 minutes, walking the baby slowly around the kitchen when the crying got bad, because motion sometimes helped when nothing else did. Her arms ached from holding the child for hours, and her back had developed a deep, persistent complaint that she was ignoring. At 2:30, Rose had finally stopped crying and gone to a fitful half-sleep against Clara's shoulder, her breathing audible, slightly labored in the way that made Clara keep her hand pressed lightly against the baby's back to feel every breath. She did not let herself think about Elias on the road. She'd put that in a separate place in her mind and locked it, and was not going to open it because there was nothing she could do about it, and the thing she could do something about was here in her arms and needed all of her. This was something she had learned from necessity over the years, the ability to partition. To put one terrible thing behind a door and turn entirely to the thing that was in front of her. She wasn't sure if it was a strength or damage. Probably some of both. "Is she worse?" Nora said from the bench. "She's about the same," Clara said. "That's better than getting worse." Nora was quiet. "When Mama got sick," she said carefully, "she got worse. And then Papa told us she wasn't going to get better, and then she didn't." She said it in the factual voice, the one she used for things she'd processed past the point of acute pain into something else. "I keep thinking about that when I look at Rose." "Rose is going to be all right," Clara said. "You don't know that for certain." "No," Clara admitted, "but I'm going to make it as true as I can make it. That's all any of us can do." Nora looked at the window, white and opaque. "Do you think Papa is okay?" Clara kept her face even. "Your father knows this land better than anyone. He knows the road to Hardwick in the dark." She believed this. She was also aware that believing it and it being sufficient were different things. "He does," Nora said, with the firmness of a child deciding to trust something because the alternative was unbearable. "He rode it once in a flood year when I was little. He brought back medicine for the croup." She pulled the blanket tighter. "He came back then." "He'll come back now," Clara said. She said it like it was true. She needed it to be true. She didn't examine the need too closely. At 4 in the morning, Rose's temperature spiked again. Clara felt it before she checked. The way the baby's body changed against her, going from the restless half-sleep to something more alarming. The small muscles tightening, the breathing shallowing. She laid Rose on the kitchen table and checked her in the lamplight and felt her own chest go tight in a way she didn't allow herself to express. "Get me the cloths from the nursery," she told Nora. "All of them. And the bottle on the chest, the dark glass one." Nora was on her feet before Clara finished talking, blanket trailing behind her as she ran for the stairs. Clara worked with what she had, which was skill and knowledge and nothing else. No doctor, no medicine beyond the camphor oil in the dark glass bottle, and the basic tools of cool water and careful hands. She stripped Rose down to her underclothes despite the baby's vigorous and vocal protest, because the fever needed to move out of the body and clothing held it in. She wetted the cloths and applied them methodically. Neck, wrists, the soles of the feet, which people often forgot. She kept her movements deliberate and steady, talking to Rose in a low, continuous voice, not because the baby understood the words, but because the sound of a calm voice did something, and Clara needed to keep herself calm as much as she needed to keep Rose from panic. "You're okay," she said. "You're right here with me. I've got you. You're okay." Nora came back with the cloths and the bottle and stood on the other side of the table, watching with a face that had gone very still. She handed Clara what she needed when she needed it without being asked, reading the situation with that preternatural child perception that Clara had come to rely on without fully realizing she'd been doing it. "Is there anything else?" Nora said. "Stoke the stove," Clara said. "And then I need you to do something harder." "What?" "Go back to the bench and stay there and don't panic, because the baby will feel your panic even if she can't see you, and I need the room calm." Nora's jaw tightened. She was 8 years old and being asked to hold herself together when everything in her probably wanted to fracture, and she did it. Clara watched her do it, watched the child physically set her shoulders and go to the stove and stoke it, and then go back to the bench and sit down with her hands folded on her knees and her face deliberately composed. The next hour was the hardest. The fever refused to come down. Clara kept working. Cloths replaced when they warmed, water offered and mostly refused. The camphor applied to the baby's chest because it opened the breathing even when it did nothing for the temperature. Rose cycled between furious protest and exhausted silence, and both states were frightening in their own way. The silence more so. The way the baby's face went slack and distant, in a way that made Clara lean in close to check the breathing every few minutes. She thought about Margaret Boone, who had organized the nursery chest with such deliberate care. She thought about what it meant to fight this hard for a child that wasn't yours by blood or law, only by the fact of being here. She thought about Elias on the road in the dark and the wind and stopped thinking about it. She just kept working. At 5:15, something shifted. Clara had her hand on Rose's chest and felt the baby's breathing change, deepen slightly, slow from the rapid, shallow pace it had been at. She pressed her wrist to the baby's forehead and waited. The heat was still there, but something in it had changed, a quality to it. It had peaked. She could feel that, the way you felt the difference between water still rising and water that had crested. She didn't move for a full 2 minutes, just kept her wrist on the baby's forehead and counted breaths. The temperature was dropping. Not fast, not dramatically, but down. Clara exhaled. It was not a sound she meant to make. It came out of her like something she'd been holding, long and slow and completely involuntary. She put both hands flat on the table on either side of Rose and just stood there with her eyes closed for a moment. "Clara," Nora's voice very small. "She's coming down," Clara said. "The fever's breaking." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one that had preceded it. Us. The storm broke at dawn, which was more metaphor than she deserved, Clara thought. The wind dropped inside of an hour, going from that roaring constant pressure to gusts, and then to intermittent movement, and then to an exhausted calm. The light that came through the snow-packed windows was the flat white gray of a world that had been thoroughly rearranged overnight. Clara was still in the kitchen, Rose asleep against her shoulder, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow, labored ones coming up the lane. She was at the front door before Nora, who had fallen asleep on the bench sometime after 6, even stirred. She got the door open and stood on the porch in the cold and looked out at the yard. The gray horse came through the gate at a walk that was almost a stagger, head low, moving with the heavy deliberateness of an animal that had given everything it had. Elias was in the saddle, but barely. He was slumped forward with both hands on the saddle horn, and behind him, on a horse that looked steadier, was a man Clara didn't recognize, with a black bag strapped behind his saddle. The doctor. Clara went down the porch steps into the snow. She reached the gray horse first and got her hands on the bridle. Elias raised his head when she touched the horse. His face was, she didn't have a word for it immediately. He'd been out in that for 4 hours minimum, and it showed in a way that frightened her. His lips were the wrong color, and the skin on his exposed face had the peculiar tight quality of someone who had been very cold for a very long time. And there was a tremor in his hands that she could see even in the dim morning light. "Did she?" he started. "She's inside and her fever broke an hour ago," Clara said. "She's sleeping." He closed his eyes. The relief that went through him was so complete and so physical that his whole body shifted with it, the tension going out of him like a rope releasing. "You need to get off that horse," Claire said. Her voice had gone strange, tighter than she meant it to be. "Right now, can you—" "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Get down." The doctor had already dismounted and was tying his horse to the post. He came around quickly, assessing Elias with the professional eye of a man who had seen cold exposure before. "Help me get him inside," he said to Clara. Not asking, telling, which she appreciated. They got Elias off the horse between them, which was more difficult than it should have been because he kept insisting he could do it himself, and his legs were not in agreement with this position. He made it to the porch steps on his own, and then Clara got under his arm, and they went up together and into the house. Nora was in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, awake now, taking in the sight of her father being half carried through the front door with a face that went through several things at once. "Papa," she said. "I'm all right," Elias said. He said it to Nora specifically, changing his voice for her the way adults did when they were not all right, but needed a child to believe they were. Clara wasn't sure Nora believed it, but the girl stepped back and let them through. They got him to the kitchen, closest to the stove, and Clara sat him in the chair nearest the heat and started pulling his outer coat off while the doctor went up to see Rose. Elias's hands, when she got the gloves off, were stiff. The fingers pale and waxy in a way she didn't like, though he had movement in them, which meant the worst hadn't happened. "Can you feel these?" she said, holding his hands. "Not much," he admitted. "Don't rub them." She wrapped both his hands in her own and held them against her chest, which was the most effective thing available, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read because his face was still half frozen and its usual vocabulary was limited. "You should have been more careful," she said. "Rose needed—" "I know what Rose needed. I was here managing it." She kept her voice low so Nora, across the kitchen, wouldn't hear the edge in it. "I also know what you needed was not to ride 20 miles in a blizzard alone." "I wasn't alone on the way back. The doctor— On the way there, you were alone." He was quiet. His hands were beginning to warm. She could feel it, the stiffness in his fingers easing by degrees. "If I'd waited for morning," he said, "the storm would have been worse." "Yes," she said. "You're right about that." She said it because it was true, not because she wasn't still frightened by how he looked. He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and Nora's quiet movement and the sounds of the doctor moving around upstairs. "I couldn't stay here and do nothing," he said. I couldn't." "I know," Claire said. She did know. She understood it exactly. "But you came back." "I came back," he confirmed, like he needed to say it out loud. She held his hands against her chest and let him warm up. And the morning light continued to grow at the windows, and somewhere upstairs Rose made a sound. A real sound. A healthy protest sound. A baby sound. And both of them heard it and went still. Nora's voice, carefully calm. "She's awake." The doctor's name was Prentice, and he was a compact, unhurried man in his 60s who examined Rose with the thoroughness of someone who'd trained himself to be slow precisely because situations wanted to rush him. He came down from the nursery after 20 minutes while Nora sat upstairs with the baby, and found Clara and Elias in the kitchen, Elias still wrapped in the blanket Clara had put around him, color slowly coming back to his face. Prentice looked at them both and then at the kitchen, the evidence of the night written in damp cloths on the table, and the jar of camphor oil, and the chair positioned exactly where someone had been sitting for hours. And he made a small sound that might have been approval. "Fevers broke clean," he said. "Lungs sound clear. Whatever you did it right." He was looking at Clara when he said it. "She's going to be sore and tired for a couple of days, but she's past the danger." Elias let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "There's going to be some residual inflammation," Prentice continued, setting his bag on the table and opening it. "I'm going to leave you something for that. Keep her warm, keep fluids in her, don't let her get overtired." He glanced at Elias. "You, meanwhile, are a different concern." "I'm fine." "You're not, but you're going to be." He examined Elias's hands with the same thoroughness he'd given Rose. "Frostnip, not frostbite. You got lucky, or you were faster than you should have been able to be in that." He glanced at Clara again, then back at Elias. "Keep them warm and dry. Feeling will come back fully, might be a bit unpleasant when it does. Don't expose them to cold again until I tell you to." "I've got a ranch to run," Elias said. "You've got help," Prentice said mildly, nodding toward Clara. Elias looked at Clara. She looked back at him steadily. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I do." Prentice stayed long enough to drink coffee. Clara made it, and he received it with the gratitude of a man who had ridden through a blizzard in the dark and felt he'd earned it. And then he made his way back out into the rearranged world, the storm's aftermath lying white and deep and still across the yard. The house felt different after he left. Quieter, but differently quiet than before. Not the tense quiet of a night being endured, but the quiet of things having been resolved. Of the crisis on the other side rather than ahead. Nora came downstairs and reported that Rose had gone back to sleep, properly this time, without the shallow, labored quality from the night before. She said this with the satisfaction of someone delivering good intelligence, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head down on her arms. Clara put a hand briefly on the girl's back. "Sleep here if you want." "I'm not tired," Nora said, already at half volume. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Elias was watching Clara from across the table. He still had the blanket around his shoulders, and he looked like a man who had been thoroughly through something, which he had, but his color was better now and his eyes were clear. "You stayed up all night with her," he said. "Yes." When I left, I didn't know if you'd—" He stopped. "I knew you would," he corrected. "I knew it. That's why I could go." Clara sat down in the chair across from him. The exhaustion was arriving now, the kind that had been deferred by necessity and was claiming its due. Her eyes felt like they had weight in them. "She scared me," Clara admitted. "Around 4 in the morning, she scared me pretty badly." Elias looked at the table. "But you held on." "I held on." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the world was still and white, and the sun was fully up now, doing nothing to warm things but at least providing light. The clean, brilliant light of a world after a hard snow, every surface reflecting it back doubled. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know what this place would be without you." He said it simply, without ornament, in the voice he used for things he'd thought about carefully before saying. I've been trying to figure out how to say that for a while. I'm not good at this kind of thing." "You're doing all right," she said. "I just mean—" He rubbed the back of his neck with one bandaged hand, an awkward gesture. "You came here because your horse gave out. And you stayed because I don't even know entirely why you stayed. And you were here last night when I couldn't be. And you held this family together when I was out on a road in a blizzard. And I think about that and I don't know what the right word is for what that means." Clara looked at him across the table and at this man who was tired and slightly frostbitten and not good with words but was trying anyway, in his kitchen, in the morning after the worst night Iron Ridge had seen in years. "It means I was here," she said. "That's enough for now." He nodded. His eyes didn't move from her face, and there was something in them, not the careful evaluation of the early weeks, not the grief-tired distance she'd first seen there. Something else. Something she recognized but wasn't going to name out loud. Not today. Not when they were both running on no sleep and adrenaline and the particular rawness of a night survived. Not today. But she recognized it. "Get some sleep," she said. "Both your hands need to be still for a few hours, and there's nothing outside that won't hold until afternoon. The cattle, I'll check the cattle. Clara. Elias." She looked at him steadily. "Let someone carry a piece of it." He recognized his own words coming back at him. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said. She left him in the kitchen with the fire and the sleeping Nora and the quiet morning, and she pulled on her coat and her boots and went out into the snow-bright world to check on the cattle, who were cold and mildly resentful about the state of the south pasture fence, but otherwise intact. She stood in the field for a moment and looked back at the ranch house. The gray weathered wood, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the window upstairs where Rose was sleeping. The sky above it was the sharp, clear blue that came after storms, the kind of blue that felt like it meant something even when you knew it didn't. She was so tired her hands weren't entirely steady. She had never in her life felt less like running. The days after the blizzard had a particular quality to them, the kind of stillness that followed violent things, where the world seemed to be taking stock of itself. Iron Ridge sat under 2 feet of snow, and the work contracted to what was essential. Feed the cattle, keep the pipes from freezing, keep the fires going, keep Rose warm and rested and fed. Clara moved through these tasks with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything here. But something was different in the house now, and she could feel it the way you felt a change in the air before weather. Not named yet, but present. Elias's hands healed slowly. Dr. Prentice had been right about the feeling coming back. It happened over 3 days, and it was unpleasant, the nerves waking up in stages, his fingers going through a cycle of tingling and then real pain before settling into something functional. He didn't complain about it. He just worked around it with the stubbornness of a man who didn't know a different way to be, switching tasks to things he could manage one-handed or with reduced grip, asking Clara without apparent embarrassment when something genuinely required 2 working hands. She helped him without making anything of it. That was the system they'd arrived at, without ever discussing it. Things that needed doing got done by whoever could do them, and neither of them kept score about it. But something had shifted between them since the night of the storm. Something that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been visible before. And Clara felt it in the way he watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, and in the way conversations between them had started going longer than strictly necessary, drifting past the practical into something without a clear destination. She noticed it and let it sit untouched, the way you left something fragile on a shelf and just kept an eye on it. There was still the matter of Crestfall. She'd known for weeks that the story was going to have to be told properly, not the Silas version, the abbreviated second-hand version designed by people who had no interest in the truth of it, but the actual version, with its inconvenient complexity and its parts that didn't reflect well on anyone, including Clara. She'd been building up to it the way you built up to a difficult thing, circling it in your mind, figuring out the shape of it. The moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the storm, when Nora was at school and Rose was sleeping, and Elias came into the kitchen to find Clara sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a person who had arrived somewhere internally. He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her, not at the other end of the table, but in the chair diagonal to hers, closer than he'd have sat a month ago, and looked at her with the patient attention that was one of the things about him she'd come to rely on without meaning to. "Tell me," he said. Just that. Not "you don't have to," or "when you're ready," or any of the other polite frames that would have given her an exit. Just the simple invitation. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at him. "I was 23, she said. "I was working as a bookkeeper in Crestfall for a land office there, Deering and Associates. Holt Deering owned it. He was 40, established, well-regarded in the county, married with 2 children." She paused. "He was also the only man in that town who treated me like I had a functioning brain, who gave me real work to do and paid attention to what I produced and talked to me like an adult." She said this without sentimentality, just accurately. "I was 23 and I'd come from nothing, and I thought that meant something. I was wrong about what it meant." Elias said nothing. He was listening the way he listened, fully, without preparing his response. "He told me his marriage was finished in everything but name, that his wife had agreed they would separate once his youngest was old enough, that that there was something real between us and he wanted to build on it." She kept her voice flat because the flatness was protective and she needed it right now. "I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to stand here and say I was completely innocent of poor judgment. I knew he was married. I told myself the story he gave me was true because I wanted it to be true. That's the part that's on me." "How long?" Elias said. 8 months. Long enough that I had written letters, fool letters, the kind you wrote when you were 23 and hadn't learned yet that written things had a way of outlasting the feelings that produced them. She looked at her coffee cup. His wife found them. She was not a woman who dealt with things privately. She went to the minister, to the sheriff, to every person in town who would listen, and she told them everything and then some. The "and then some" part was the damage. She said things about my character that went beyond what the letters showed, implied things that weren't in the letters. Her jaw tightened. And people believed her because she was a respectable woman, and I was a bookkeeper with no family and no standing, and the story she was telling was more interesting than the truth. "What was the truth?" Elias said. "That I was stupid, and I was lonely, and I trusted someone I shouldn't have, and I got used. That's it. That's the whole truth." She finally looked up at him. "There was no string of men. There was no long history of this kind of behavior. There was one man who lied to me skillfully, and a lot of people who preferred the more dramatic version of events." She held his gaze. "I want you to know the whole thing, not because I need you to think well of me, but because you deserve to know what you actually have in your house and what you've been trusting with your children." Elias was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone trying to figure out what to say. The quiet of someone who was sitting with what they'd just heard and treating it seriously enough to not respond to it instantly. "Holt Deering," he said finally. "What happened to him?" "He told everyone his wife had misunderstood the letters, that I had pursued him inappropriately and he had handled it poorly. He kept his business and his home and his standing." Clara said it without particular bitterness, though the bitterness was there underneath. She'd just had 4 years to put it somewhere manageable. "He's still there, as far as I know. And you've been walking since then." "I've been working where I can and moving when I have to." She paused. "Twice I tried to stay somewhere long enough to build something, and both times the story arrived ahead of me or right behind me, and I had to leave before it took root." She looked at him steadily. "It will come here eventually. If it hasn't already, it will. You should know that going in." Elias turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Both hands, which 2 weeks ago he couldn't have done without pain. He was looking at the surface of the table with the focused expression of a man doing careful thinking. "My wife," he said after a while, "was talked about when she first came here. Did I ever tell you that?" Clara shook her head. "She came from Kansas. Her first husband died, farming accident, and she had nothing. She came west looking for work, and somebody wrote ahead to a woman in Hardwick that Margaret was a certain kind of woman, that she'd had the husband killed for the insurance." He said it with a kind of quiet anger that was old and settled. It wasn't true. Not a word of it. Some woman in Kansas who'd wanted the husband for herself wrote the letter and sent it on. Margaret found out about it a month after she arrived here, from a woman at the general store who told her to her face that she knew what kind of person she was. Clara hadn't known any of this. She sat with it. "She stayed," Elias said. "She told me later she'd thought about leaving. But she stayed and she did her work, and after a while the people who mattered figured out what she was actually like. And the ones who didn't matter continued to believe the letter, and she just stopped trying to change their minds." He looked up at Clara. "The people who'd met her knew who she was. The rest of it was just noise." "That's a generous parallel," Clara said carefully. "It's not a parallel. It's a different story." He met her eyes. "But the principle's the same." Clara sat with that for a moment. Something in her chest felt different than it had 5 minutes ago. Some tension that had been there so long she'd forgotten it was tension had shifted slightly, like a door that had been stuck opening a degree or two. "Silas should know the truth," she said. "Not for my sake, because he made a decision about me based on something false, and I'd rather he knew." "Silas is coming for Christmas," Elias said. "He said so in his last letter." "Then I'll tell him when he comes." Elias nodded. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been careful not to name. Steadier now than it had been in the kitchen the morning after the storm. More settled, like something had been confirmed rather than discovered. "For what it's worth," he said, "it doesn't change anything about what I think. What you did in this house, what you did that night with Rose, that's what I know about you. The rest is just someone else's story." Clara looked at him. She wasn't going to be sentimental about it. She wasn't going to treat it as more than what it was, which was a man saying a true thing simply and directly. But she let herself receive it, which was something she wasn't always good at. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for basic sense," he said, with a trace of something that on a different face might have been called dry. He stood up, taking his coffee with him. "The Henderson cattle are coming in tomorrow. I need to check the east gate this afternoon. You want to come?" "Give me 10 minutes to check on Rose," Clara said. 10 minutes, he agreed, and went to get his coat. Silas arrived 4 days before Christmas on a clear, knife-cold afternoon, his horse loaded with a side of cured ham and a crate of things from the Hardwick General Store that he set on the porch without ceremony. Nora went out to meet him before he'd finished tying his horse, and he submitted to her enthusiastic inspection of the crate's contents with the patience of a man who had been managing Nora's curiosity for 8 years, and knew better than to resist it. He looked up at Clara on the porch, with an expression that hadn't yet decided what it was. "Whitmore," he said. "Boone," she said. He carried the crate in and set it on the kitchen table, and Nora immediately began cataloging the contents with the thoroughness of a customs official. Silas watched her for a moment, then looked around the kitchen, taking in what was different, the same way he had on his first visit, the same inventory check, and then looked at Clara with the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. "Place looks better than it did in November," he said. This was, from Silas, something close to a compliment. "It's getting there," Clara said. Elias came in from outside, and the two brothers did the handshake shoulder grip thing that men did when they were glad to see each other but weren't going to say so, and then they went through the practical exchange, the state of the roads, the weather system coming in from the north, the Henderson cattle deal that had closed at better than expected numbers. Clara put the ham on and let the conversation move around her. That evening, after Nora had gone to bed and Rose was down and the kitchen had gone quiet with the fire banked and the cold pressing at the windows, Clara sat down across from Silas at the kitchen table. Elias was there too. He'd positioned himself slightly back, present, but making it clear this was Clara's conversation to have. She appreciated that. "I want to tell you about Crestfall," she said. Silas looked at her steadily. "He didn't say you don't have to, because he was Silas, and he'd already said he wanted to know. He just waited. She told it the same way she'd told Elias, plainly, chronologically, without softening the parts that reflected poorly on her judgment. Silas was harder to read than Elias during it. He kept his face more controlled, and the only sign that he was tracking it carefully was the way his eyes stayed on her face without moving. He was a man who listened with his whole face when he was actually listening. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Silas turned his coffee cup slowly, the same gesture Elias had made, which struck her briefly as a family trait. Then he looked at her. "Deering," he said. "Yes." "He's still in business." "As far as I know." Silas's jaw did something. "I've done business with men who operate out of Crestfall," he said. "I hear things." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard a version of your story from Kemper Brothers, like I said. What I didn't hear, what they didn't say, or maybe didn't know, was anything about the letters being one-sided. The version I heard was that you'd pursued a married man and created a situation." He looked at her directly. "That's not what you're describing." "No," Clara said. "It's not. The version I heard was also that there had been others before Deering." He said it without flinching, because he was not a man who talked around things. Multiple situations. "There were no others," Clara said. "That was Deering's wife adding texture. It served her better if I was a pattern rather than an isolated incident." Silas was quiet for a long time. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the wind that had been building all day finally made up its mind and pressed against the house with a sound that had become familiar to all of them over the past weeks. "I came in here ready to run you off," Silas said finally. "First night I arrived, I walked in that kitchen ready to tell Elias he was making a mistake keeping you here." He said it without apology, because apologizing for past positions wasn't in his nature, but he said it with a different quality than he might have said it 2 months ago. Something in it that had turned to face itself honestly. "I based that on gossip I'd received from men who got it secondhand, and I held on to it even when what I was seeing with my own eyes didn't match." "You let yourself be changed by what you saw," Clara said. "That's not nothing. It's not enough." What? He said it firmly, like it was a line in an account book, and he needed it recorded correctly. "I told you to your face that I knew who you were, in front of my brother, in front of this." He gestured a slightly awkward gesture for a man not given to gestures, at the kitchen, at the evidence of the household around them. "I was wrong about that. I want to say it clearly." Clara looked at him. Silas Boone was not a man who found this easy. She could see that. The words were costing him something, and he was paying it anyway. "I hear you," she said. "I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it in Hardwick," he said. "If the story's gone around there, and it may have, I don't know, I'll say what I saw here and what I know now, for what that's worth." "It's worth something," Elias said, from his position slightly back from the table. Silas glanced at his brother. Something moved between them. Some old language that brothers developed, the kind you didn't need words for. "Yeah," Silas said. "I hope so." He looked back at Clara. "I can't undo the story that's already out there, but I can stop adding to it, and I can say different when I hear it." "That's all anyone can do," Clara said. They sat with it for a moment, all three of them, in the quiet kitchen, with the fire and the wind and the particular weight of things that had been set down properly. Christmas at Iron Ridge was not elaborate. There wasn't the money for elaborate, and Clara wouldn't have known how to navigate elaborate anyway. Her memories of holidays were functional things, occasions marked rather than celebrated. But Nora had opinions about Christmas that were non-negotiable and extensive, and so the house got a pine bough over the door and paper decorations that Nora made at the kitchen table with focused intensity, and Clara produced a Christmas dinner that was not the dinner of a prosperous house but was good. The ham from Silas, roasted with dried apples, and bread that had come out right, and a dried fruit cake that Nora had appointed herself guardian of and defended against casual sampling with ferocious dedication. They ate together, the 5 of them, Elias and Clara and Nora and Silas and Rose in her high chair at the end of the table, working on soft food with the determined seriousness of a baby discovering that food came in more varieties than milk. The table was too small for all of them comfortably, and Silas's elbow knocked Nora's water glass, and they caught it between them just before it went over, and everyone laughed, even Silas. And Clara sat in the middle of all of it, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She recognized it. She didn't say anything about it. She just passed the bread and listened to Silas describe an incident involving his fence line and a particularly determined elk that Nora found inexplicably hilarious, and watched Elias across the table. The way he was less braced than usual, the way his face moved more freely than it did when it was just the two of them, like his brother's presence licensed something. He caught her looking. She didn't look away. Neither did he. There was a moment, just a moment, and then Nora said something that demanded a response from both of them, and it passed, but she knew he'd felt it too. You couldn't be in a house together through a blizzard and a sick child and a months-long accumulation of daily life and not know when something was real. She just didn't know yet what to do with real. January was hard, and the way January was always hard on the frontier, a grinding down kind of month, not dramatic but relentless, requiring the steady application of effort to basic survival while the cold refused to ease and the daylight hours offered only a few hours of useful light. Clara had lived through Wyoming winters before, but never like this, never from inside a place rather than passing through it, and she discovered that there was a significant difference between enduring a winter and inhabiting one. She was inhabiting this one. Small things marked the difference. The way she knew which floorboard creaked outside Rose's room and avoided it automatically in the night. The way she'd come to understand the rhythms of the cattle. Which ones moved to the south fence when they were agitated, and what it usually meant. The particular angle at which the kitchen window let in the morning light and the hour it shifted from gray to gold. These were the things you learned in a place you stayed, not a place you passed through, and she had accumulated them without noticing, the way you accumulated a language by immersion, slowly and then all at once. Rose was walking now, or attempting to, the staggering, enthusiastic gait of an infant who had recently discovered the concept and was committed to it regardless of the considerable failure rate. She used Clara's legs as a recovery surface, grabbing them when the walking went wrong and using them to right herself before setting off again with undiminished confidence. Clara found this, the trust in it, the casual certainty that the legs would be there, harder to look at directly than almost anything else. Nora, who was old enough to be self-conscious about the things she felt, handled the accumulating months differently. She had begun to treat Clara with a specific kind of ease that Clara recognized as significant. The ease you had with a person you'd stopped assessing and started simply including. She talked to Clara the way she talked to herself, without the audience quality, just the running commentary of a mind that processed things out loud. She showed Clara her schoolwork not for approval, but for the particular pleasure of showing someone. She had opinions about how Clara braided her hair and shared them without being asked. One afternoon in mid-January, Clara was in the back bedroom sorting through the warped shelf problem she'd finally gotten the time to address properly when Nora appeared in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said. "You're going to either way," Clara said, pulling a shelf board free. "Do you love my father?" Clara stopped pulling the shelf board. She turned and looked at Nora, who was leaning in the doorway with her arms crossed and her serious face on. Not the child version of serious, where it was mostly performance, but the real version that came out when she was actually asking a real question and wanted a real answer. "That's a very direct question," Clara said. "I'm tired of watching you both act like you're not thinking about it," Nora said. "It's been months. It's exhausting." Clara set the shelf board down carefully. She thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest and age-appropriate and not something she'd regret. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the truth. What I know is that I care about this place and everyone in it a great deal more than I expected to. What comes after that? I'm still working out." Nora was quiet for a moment, running some interior calculation. "He's different than he was before Mama died," she said. He got more quiet. He used to laugh more." She said it not accusatorially, just as a fact she'd been sitting with. "He's been less quiet lately." "I know," Clara said. "That's you doing that," Nora said. "I just wanted you to know I noticed." She left before Clara could respond, which was possibly deliberate. Clara sat on the floor of the back bedroom with the shelf board across her knees and looked at the wall for a long moment. The conversation with Elias that she'd been not quite having for 2 months arrived on a Tuesday evening in late January when the temperature outside had dropped to the kind of cold that made the house timbers pop and contract, and they were both in the kitchen after Nora and Rose were in bed, and there was no particular reason for either of them to still be up, except that they hadn't gone to bed yet. He was mending a harness at the table and she was reading an old newspaper from Hardwick she'd already read once but was reading again because it was there. And neither of them was talking, but the silence had the quality it had developed over months, the kind of silence that was full rather than empty. "Clara," he said. She lowered the newspaper. He set down the harness and the needle. He looked at her with the direct, unornamented gaze that was just how he looked at things when he was being serious. "I'm not good at this," he said preemptively. "I'm telling you that up front so you have fair warning." "I know," she said. "You're doing fine." "I've been thinking about what this is," he said. "What's happening here, between—" He made a slight gesture. "I've been thinking about it for a while, and I keep not saying anything because I don't know if you want me to, and also because I'm not entirely sure what I'd say." "Say what you've got," Clara said. "I'll tell you if it's wrong." He exhaled, a short sound, not quite a laugh, almost one. "I think you might be the most important person who's come into this ranch since Margaret," he said. "And I know what that sounds like. And I'm not trying to put one thing on top of another thing. I'm not trying to—" He stopped, restarted. "I don't know how to do this without it sounding like I'm asking you to fill a space. I don't mean it that way." "I know you don't," Clara said. "What I mean is that you're—" He looked at the table and then back up at her. "You're a specific person who I've come to think about in a specific way. Not because of what you do here, though that matters. Because of who you are when you think no one is watching. The way you are with Rose when she's scared. The way you talked to Nora that first night in the kitchen. The way you stood in front of Silas and didn't flinch." He said it with the careful specificity of a man who had prepared these examples and was deploying them deliberately, and somehow the preparation made it more sincere rather than less. "I'm not asking you anything tonight. I just wanted to say it out loud, where you could hear it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the cold was so complete and so still that the silence of it pressed against the house. She thought about Crestfall and the road she'd been on and the 60 cents in her coat pocket and the horse that had given out 3 miles east of here. She thought about all the places she'd been that weren't this. She thought about what Nora had said. "He's been less quiet lately." And the truth of it. "I came here to ask for water," she said. "I know. I didn't plan any of this. I know that too. I have things in me that aren't fixed," she said. "Things from Crestfall and before Crestfall. I'm not going to pretend I came to this in perfect condition. I buried my wife 7 months ago," he said. "I'm not exactly undamaged either." Clara looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "All right," she said. "I hear what you're saying." "That's all," he said. "Just that." She nodded. He picked up the harness and the needle and went back to mending it, and she raised the newspaper, and the fire kept burning, and the cold kept pressing, and the house held. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had been resolved with the neatness that stories like to impose on things. But something had been said out loud, where the other person could hear it, and that was its own kind of step. The small, deliberate kind that didn't look like much from the outside, but that changed the terrain going forward. She read the newspaper until the lamp needed trimming, and then she went to bed, and she lay on the cot in the sewing room that had been her room for 3 months now, and listened to the house settle around her in the cold. She thought, this is a place. Not a place I am staying. Not a place I might leave. Just a place. The way you thought about something that had stopped being conditional. That was new. She'd been carrying the weight of Crestfall so long that she hadn't noticed the way it had been. Day by day and task by task, and small, honest conversation by small, honest conversation, getting lighter. She noticed it now. Its absence more visible than its presence had ever been, the way you noticed a sound only when it stopped. It wasn't gone. She knew it wasn't gone. There would be days when it came back, when something triggered it, when the old shame rose up with its old insistence. She knew herself well enough to know that. But tonight it was quiet. And the house was warm, and the children were sleeping, and somewhere down the hall a man who wasn't good at this kind of thing had said something true out loud because she deserved to hear it. That was enough for tonight, more than enough. February broke without ceremony. One morning Clara walked out to the well and noticed that the cold had a different quality to it. Still sharp, still serious, but with something underneath that hadn't been there the day before. A give to it. The way iron had a give when it was held near heat long enough. Winter was not over, not even close, but something in it had shifted from absolute to provisional, and after the months they'd been through, provisional felt like a gift. She stood at the well with the bucket in her hand and looked out at the ranch in the early light. The gray wood of the barn against the white field, the cattle moving along the south fence with more energy than they'd had in weeks, the chimney smoke rising straight up in the still air. And she had the particular feeling she'd been having more frequently lately, the one she still didn't entirely trust, that she was looking at something that was hers to look at, not owned, not claimed in any legal or official sense, but hers in the way that things became yours when you'd been present for them long enough, when you'd worked on them and worried about them and sat with them through the worst they had to offer. She brought the water in and started the breakfast, and when Nora came downstairs in her school clothes, she was already talking before she hit the bottom step, which meant the day was going to be a full one. Miss Alderton says we're doing the spring exhibition in April and I want to do a recitation, but Henry Marsh also wants to do a recitation, and she says only one of us can because there isn't time for both. So I think I should do it because Henry did it last year, and it's my turn, but he says last year doesn't count because he was sick for part of it. Sit down and eat, Claire said. I'm just saying, I heard you. Sit down and eat, and we'll talk about Henry Marsh after you've had something in you. Nora sat, with the put-upon expression of someone who had important things to discuss and was being unreasonably delayed. Elias came in from the barn while she was eating, stamping snow off his boots at the door, and received the Henry Marsh situation as an update delivered at speed while he poured his coffee. Sounds like you should talk to Miss Alderton, he said. I did talk to Miss Alderton. She's the one who said only one of us can do it. Then talk to her again with a better argument. Nora considered this. What would a better argument be? That's for you to figure out, Elias said, which was exactly the kind of answer that frustrated Nora, and also, Claire had observed, was exactly the right answer for a child who needed to learn how to build a case rather than just assert one. Nora finished eating, collected her things, and went out into the morning with the energy of someone who had already moved on to composing the argument in her head. The door closed behind her, and the kitchen went quiet in the particular way it did when Nora left. A noticeable subtraction, like a sound you hadn't been aware of until it stopped. Elias sat down at the table with his coffee. He looked at Clara with the morning easy look that had replaced the careful assessment of the early months. Still not effusive, he was not a man who did effusive, but open in a way that was its own form of warmth. Temperature changed this morning, he said. I noticed. 6 weeks, maybe 8, before it's workable out there. He meant the land, the ground that had been frozen solid since November, that would need to thaw before any real spring work could begin. There's a lot that needs doing. There's always a lot that needs doing, Claire said. More than usual this year. The east pasture fence is worse than I thought, and the barn roof needs attention before spring rains. He paused, turning the coffee cup. I was thinking about bringing on a hand, someone to help with the heavy work. I've got enough from the Henderson sale to do it. That's a good idea, Claire said. She meant it. The ranch had been running on Elias's labor, and her management and the goodwill of a man whose body had been through more than it should have been asked to absorb in a single season. He nodded. There was a pause that had something in it, a quality she'd learned to recognize over the months, the pause that meant he was building towards something. I also want to talk about the arrangement, he said. Clara looked at him. What we've been doing, he said, with the slight awkwardness of a man who was precise about physical things and less precise about this kind of thing. Room and board. That's not what this is anymore, and we both know it. What is it? Clara said, not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked at her steadily. I want you to have a stake in this place, he said. A real one. Not an employee's stake. Something that means... He paused. I want you to know that what you've built here is yours too. That you're not here at my convenience. That it doesn't end if I decide it ends. Clara sat with the weight of that. That's a significant thing to offer, she said carefully. I know what I'm offering. Elias, let me say it properly, he said. He set down his coffee and looked at her with the directness he brought to things that mattered. I'm not asking you to forget Crestfall. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not, or to come into this with no conditions. I know you've got reasons to be careful. I know you've been burned by someone who made promises he didn't keep. He held her gaze. I'm telling you that I'm asking you to stay. Not for the winter. Not until the next road looks better. To stay here and build this with me properly in whatever way makes sense to you. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this man, at the tiredness that was permanent in his face, but had shifted from the grief tiredness of the early months to something more like the tiredness of a man who was working hard toward something worth working toward. She looked at the hands around the coffee cup, healed now, the frost-nipped scars faded to barely visible. She thought about the night he'd ridden 20 miles in a blizzard because he couldn't stand still and do nothing when someone he loved was in danger, and how that was a flaw and a virtue simultaneously, the way most real things were. She thought about what belonging had felt like before this, the versions of it she'd reached for that turned out to be something else. She thought about how she'd spent 4 years becoming very good at leaving, and how that skill had stopped feeling like strength somewhere around the time she'd started making bread in this kitchen and knowing by feel when the dough was right. She thought about Nora downstairs on that first night, peeling a potato and saying people are who they are no matter what they tell you they are, and how much she'd come to believe that was true, and how much she hoped it was true about herself. I have a condition, she said. Name it. I want to send a letter to Crestfall, she said, to the county records office. There are financial records at Deering and Associates that I did the books there for 2 years. I know things about how that office operated that would be relevant to people who are currently being damaged by it. She watched his face. I've been not doing it because I was afraid of drawing attention back to myself. But if I'm staying here, if this is real, then I'm not running from it anymore. I'm going to do what I should have done 4 years ago. Elias didn't hesitate. Do it, he said. It might cause trouble. People might come asking, oh, let them come, he said. This is your home. You deal with trouble from your home, not from a road. Clara looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, you'll stay, or all right, you'll send the letter. Both, she said. Something happened in his face. Not a dramatic thing, not the kind of expression that announced itself. Just a settling, a release of something held for a long time. He picked up his coffee cup. Good, he said. And that was that. No ceremony, no declaration, just 2 people at a kitchen table in February, with the fire going and the cold easing outside, and a ranch that needed work and children that needed raising, deciding to do it together. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and Clara felt it land in her chest like something solid taking root. Spring came in the imperfect, negotiated way that Wyoming springs always did. 3 warm days and then a late frost, mud that made the east pasture impassable for a week, the cattle restless and the barn roof leaking where Elias hadn't quite gotten to it before the rains arrived. The new hand, a young man named Cord Jeffers, who was 17 and worked with the steady, uncomplaining effort of someone who was grateful to have the work, got initiated into Iron Ridge by spending his first week hauling mud-soaked hay and not complaining once, which earned him Elias's respect in a way that a month of good behavior couldn't have managed. Clara sent the letter to Crestfall in March. She wrote it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while the house was quiet, writing 3 drafts before she got it right. Not too much, not performing injury, just a precise and factual account of the financial practices she'd observed at Deering and Associates during her 2 years there, with specific references to the record-keeping irregularities she'd noted and the names of the parties who had been overcharged or misrepresented in land transactions. She did not write about what had happened between herself and Holt Deering. That was a separate matter and not what the letter was for. The letter was for the people who were still being harmed by a business that operated without accountability. She addressed it to the Territorial Land Office and sealed it and set it on the kitchen windowsill and looked at it for a moment. Then she put her coat on and went to do the afternoon feeding. The response came 6 weeks later in the form of a letter from a territorial land officer named Beaumont asking for clarification on 2 specific points. Clara wrote back with the clarification. There was a third exchange after that, and then silence. And 3 months later, in June, when the ranch was fully into its spring work and the pace of life had accelerated to the point that the letter from Crestfall felt like it belonged to a different era. A final letter arrived informing her that an inquiry had been opened into the practices at Deering and Associates. She read it at the kitchen table and set it down. Nora was across the table, nominally doing her schoolwork, but actually watching Clara with the focused attention she brought to things she considered important. "Good news or bad?" Nora said. "Good," Clara said. "Old good. The kind that takes a long time coming and lands quiet." Nora nodded sagely, as though she understood exactly what that meant. Maybe she did. She was 9 now, and 9 at Iron Ridge was not the same as 9 anywhere else Clara could think of. "Does it mean Crestfall is finished?" Nora asked. Clara thought about that. "It means I'm finished with Crestfall," she said, "which is a different thing, but better." But Silas came back in April with a woman named Frances, who was 40 and had the straightforward competence of someone who had been running her own household for 20 years and didn't need anyone's approval about it. She arrived at Iron Ridge with Silas the way she apparently arrived everywhere, so, without fuss, took stock of the kitchen within 5 minutes of entering it and told Clara she had an excellent arrangement with the larder. Clara liked her immediately, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't expected to like someone Silas had chosen, and then felt faintly guilty about the assumption. They were not married yet, Frances and Silas. That was coming in the fall, they said, once the business of 2 ranches could be properly organized around the combining of them. But they moved through the space of Iron Ridge with the ease of 2 people who had already made the decision and were just waiting on the paperwork. Silas was different with Frances present, not unrecognizable. Still himself, still that compressed, direct, inventory-taking version of a man, but with the edges slightly different. Less load-bearing somehow, like a structure that had been reinforced and could afford to flex a little now. He found Clara alone in the garden, the kitchen garden she'd started in March, still more ambition than reality at this point, the seedlings in their rows not yet impressive, and stood looking at it with his hands in his pockets. "This your doing?" he said. "Mostly," Clara said. "Nora has strong opinions about where the carrots go." "Sounds right." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rows. "I talked to the Kemper brothers," he said, "told them what I knew about Crestfall, what the actual situation was." Clara straightened from the seedlings she'd been checking. "You didn't have to do that." "I told you I would," he said. "I said it in December, and I meant it." He looked at her with the Boone directness, the same as Elias's, but with a different texture, harder and more abrupt. "They had the story wrong. I corrected it. What they do with that is their business." He paused. "I also told Henderson at the spring market. He's a gossip, and he'll repeat it, so it'll move." Clara looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, and she took a moment finding the right version of it. "Silas," she said, "I know it wasn't easy. The thing in December, saying what you said." "It wasn't," he agreed, without pretending otherwise. "It meant something." He made the sound that was half grunt and half something else. "Frances says I should practice being wrong more often," he said. "Says I'd be better company." "Frances sounds very wise," Clara said. "Don't tell her that. Her head's already at the right size." Clara laughed. It came out of her before she could moderate it. A real laugh, the involuntary kind. Silas looked briefly startled by it, and then something at the corner of his mouth moved. "She'd like you," he said. "She already does, but she'd like hearing that." He went back inside, and Clara stood in the garden with the afternoon light on the seedlings, and thought about the peculiar, sideways way that people came around to things. Not in straight lines, not in clean arcs, but in the stumbling, backtracking, occasionally graceless way that actual people move through actual change. Silas had walked into this kitchen in November, ready to run her off, and was now out correcting the story about her with the Kemper brothers. Nothing about that journey had been smooth or fast or comfortable for anyone, including her. But it was real, and it had moved in the right direction, and that was what mattered about it. The formal question came on a May evening, which was typical of Elias. Not a special occasion, not a moment staged for effect. Just a Tuesday evening with the work done, and the children in bed, and the kitchen quiet. He'd been working up to it for weeks. Clara knew this the same way she knew most things about him by now. Not because he told her, but because she'd spent 8 months learning the specific language of how Elias Boone moved toward difficult things. He got quieter in a particular way. He found reasons to be in the same room without initiating conversation. He worked on things with his hands, the harness, the fence posts, whatever was available, while some interior process ran. She'd been letting him work toward it at his own pace, which she figured was the right thing to do. You didn't rush Elias. Rushing Elias produced the verbal equivalent of a stumble. Not wrong, just off balance. She'd learned to wait for him to find his footing. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. He did not have coffee or a harness or anything else. He just sat down and looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know? You've been working up to it for 2 weeks. You fixed 3 things that didn't need fixing." She kept her face neutral. "Ask?" He exhaled through his nose in the way that was half exasperation and half something fond, and then he looked at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not quite a question. The inflection was flatter than a question, more like a statement that was waiting for another statement to complete it. That was probably not how it was supposed to sound, and they both knew it. "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her. "That's it? Did you want more? I thought you'd—" He stopped. "No, I don't know what I thought." "Elias," she looked at him across the table. "I decided in February. I've been waiting for you to ask since March." The exasperation crossed his face again, and then he laughed. An actual laugh. One of the ones that Nora had said used to happen more often, and that had been coming back gradually, the way things came back when you gave them the right conditions. It lasted only a few seconds, and it transformed his face in the way laughter did for people who didn't do it often. "March," he said. "Approximately," she said. He shook his head slightly, which was about as much self-deprecation as Elias produced. "I'll do better," he said. At the saying things." "You're doing fine," Clara said. Same thing she'd told him in January. Still true. All right. They married in June, in the yard at Iron Ridge, on a clear afternoon with the kind of sky that Wyoming did in early summer, enormous and blue, and absolutely indifferent to the small human proceedings beneath it. Silas came with Frances. Miss Alderton came from Hardwick, which surprised Clara until Nora revealed that she had personally invited her 3 weeks earlier and made Elias's case for him with what Nora described as a very good argument. Dr. Prentice came, which surprised her more, until she understood that Prentice had known Margaret Boone and that his presence was partly his way of saying that what was happening here was not the erasure of what had been, but the continuation of something worth continuing. There were 12 people in the yard. It was not a large wedding. Clara wore a dress that Frances had helped her alter, a sensible blue wool, not bridal white, which Clara had decided was not a color she had any particular relationship with. And Elias wore his good jacket that still fit him and had his hair cut the week before, which Nora had supervised with the gravity appropriate to a significant event. Nora herself was almost unbearably proud of the whole proceeding. She stood next to Clara during the ceremony with the posture of someone who had personally arranged the occasion and was monitoring its quality, and she held Rose's hand to keep the baby from wandering into the proceedings at a critical moment, which Rose did anyway at one point, toddling up to Elias mid-vow and grabbing his pant leg with both fists. Elias looked down at her and then back up, and didn't lose his place. Clara watched him say the words, the plain, direct words, said in the plain, direct way he said everything, and felt what she'd learned over 8 months to feel. Not the version of this she'd imagined at 23, the one that had gotten her into trouble, the version that was about rescue and completion and someone else solving the problem of who she was. This other thing, the thing that was about 2 specific people who had been through a specific winter together and knew each other's actual selves, flaws and injuries and silences and all, and were choosing to keep going in the same direction. That was the version that held. She knew that now. She said her own words steadily, without looking away from him. And when it was done, Nora made a sound of quiet personal triumph that was the most Nora thing Clara had heard her do. And Frances laughed, and Silas looked at the sky like a man controlling his face with some effort. Dr. Prentice raised his glass. Years had a way of becoming themselves without announcing it. The spring became summer, became fall, and then another spring. And the work of Iron Ridge accumulated the way work did. Not dramatically, but persistently, each season adding to the structure of the previous one until the structure was something solid. The east pasture fence got done properly, finally, in the summer after the wedding. The barn roof held through the second winter and then was replaced properly in the third year with Cord's help, and the neighbor Henderson, who showed up one Saturday with his 2 sons and lumber on the back of a wagon, which was the frontier way of doing large things, without fanfare, just showing up with what was needed. Clara fed them all lunch, and the roof got done in a day and a half. The kitchen garden expanded, not rapidly. Clara was not a woman who expanded things rapidly, but steadily, one bed at a time, until by the third year it was producing enough that she put up jars in fall the way Margaret had, the larder shelf full of them through the winter. And the year after that she had enough excess that she sent jars to Prentice in Hardwick and the schoolhouse in the fall, which was Nora's idea, and which Nora executed as a project with the efficiency she brought to everything she cared about. Nora, at 11, had opinions about the ranch's cattle management strategy that Elias had started incorporating without making a significant point of it. She was going to be formidable at whatever she decided to do, and Clara thought she'd probably decide to do several things simultaneously, which was going to be difficult for the people around her and very productive for the world in general. Rose, at 3 and then 4, was not like Nora in any way except that she was Boone, which meant she moved through the world with a certainty about her own presence in it that Clara found both exhausting and wonderful. She had no memory of being sick, of the night Clara had held her through the worst of the fever, of the blizzard and what it had cost. She didn't need to. She'd been held through it, and she was here. And here was the only place that mattered to a 4-year-old who was trying to climb the fence rail despite having been told 3 times that morning not to. Clara lifted her off the fence rail and set her on the ground and said 3 times, and Rose said 4 times, with the arithmetic confidence of someone who knew she was wrong but wasn't going to commit to it. 3, Clara said. 4, Rose said, but she walked away from the fence. Clara watched her go, the small, determined figure crossing the yard toward where Elias was working, heading for him with the directness of a child who knew exactly where she was wanted, and felt the feeling she'd felt so often now that it had become the texture of her days rather than an event in them. This life she was living was not the life she'd planned. It was not the life she'd imagined at 23 in Crestfall, when she'd been stupid and lonely and had mistaken attention for love and paid a very high price for the mistake. It was not any of the lives she'd tried to build and abandoned in the years of walking. It was messier than those lives had promised to be, and harder, and more various. This was the thing she came back to, the thing she'd not expected, more fully hers. That was what she'd not understood in all the years of running, that the self you were running from was going to be wherever you arrived. That the problem with leaving every place before it became real was that you never got to find out what real felt like. That belonging wasn't a quality a place had on its own. It was something you built, slowly and imperfectly, out of days given to it, out of staying when staying was hard, out of being known and choosing to be known despite the risk of it. She'd given days to Iron Ridge, hundreds of them by now, and more coming. The particular arithmetic of a life stayed rather than left. What? The letter from the Territorial Land Office came in the fall of the second year. It was not a dramatic letter. It informed her, in the flat official language of such documents, that the inquiry into Deering and Associates had concluded with findings of financial misrepresentation in 14 land transactions. Holt Deering had settled with the Territorial Authority, and the business had closed. The affected parties were being contacted. Clara read it at the kitchen table in the morning, with the autumn light coming through the window at the angle she knew exactly, and Elias's coffee cup still warm on the table from where he'd been sitting before he went out to the barn. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment. 14 families. 14 transactions where someone had been charged more than they owed or given less than they were promised or had their land claim managed in ways that served Deering rather than them. She didn't know their names. She didn't need to. She knew what it felt like to be at the mercy of a man who understood that he operated in a world where his word counted for more than yours, and she was glad, with a quiet and specific gladness, that 14 of those transactions were now in the record the way they should have been. She put the letter in the chest with the other papers, the ranch documents, the winter tallies, the children's school records, the small official artifacts of a life that had become official enough to generate them, and closed the chest. She went out to find Elias. He was in the barn, doing the morning feeding, and he looked up when she came in. She could read his face in under a second now, the same way she could read the weather and the cattle and the state of the ground. It had become the natural fluency of time spent with a specific person. "The Crestfall letter," she said. He waited. "It's done," she said. "Officially done." He put down the hay fork and looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the distance between them. He was not a man who did this often, who moved toward the emotional thing directly, but he'd gotten better at it over 2 years of practice. And he put his arms around her. Just that, no words, just held on for a moment in the horse-warm, hay-smelling quiet of the barn. Clara pressed her face briefly into his shoulder. She let herself stay there for exactly as long as she needed to, which was not long, because the particular weight she'd been carrying had already been getting lighter for 2 years, and what remained was manageable and probably always would be. Some things left marks. That was true. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but marks were not the same as wounds, and wounds were not the same as damage, and damage was not the same as being broken, and she was not broken. She had never been broken. She'd been in the wrong place with the wrong person at the wrong time, and she'd run, and eventually she'd run herself to a place where the running stopped making sense, and she'd stayed. She stepped back. She looked at him. "Come in for breakfast when you're done," she said. 20 minutes, he said. She went back out into the fall morning, into the yard she knew by heart. Every post, every rut, every place the ground settled differently after rain. And the sky was doing the thing it did in October, burning itself blue at the edges and gold in the middle. And somewhere behind her, Nora was calling something to Cord across the yard, and Rose was in the kitchen making the particular sound she made when she was doing something she wasn't supposed to be doing and was hoping no one would notice. Clara went back inside to manage the situation. The ranch was not finished. It was never going to be finished. That was the thing about a living place, a working place. It was always in the middle of itself, always something needing doing, always the next season's concerns already accumulating at the edges of this one. The cattle would need rotating before the first hard frost. The south fence had a post that wasn't sitting right. Cord was getting old enough that he'd want his own situation eventually, and they'd need to think about that. Nora had decided she wanted to learn to keep the books, and Clara had been teaching her, and she was quick. And someday, not yet, but someday, Iron Ridge would not need Clara to run the numbers because Nora would be doing it with the efficient pleasure of a person doing what they were suited for. These were not problems. They were the texture of a real life, which was indistinguishable, if you were close enough to it, from the texture of a life that was working. The truth that Clara had learned slowly and at significant cost was this: you did not arrive at a good life. You did not find it waiting at the end of a road, intact and complete, ready to be inhabited. You built it in the daily, imperfect, unglamorous way that anything real got built, with the tools you had, in the conditions you were given, alongside people who were as unfinished as you were. You made mistakes, and you stayed anyway. You were afraid, and you stayed anyway. You came from somewhere hard, and you carried it with you, because there was no version of arriving somewhere new that didn't include everything you already were. And the work was not to leave it behind, but to stop letting it make your decisions. She had stopped letting it make her decisions somewhere around a Tuesday in January, at a kitchen table, when a man who was not good at this kind of thing had said something true out loud because she deserved to hear it. That was when it had turned. Not before, not after. Then. Rose was attempting to reach the jar of sugar on the kitchen shelf when Clara came back in, standing on the rung of the chair with focused ambition, and Clara crossed the kitchen and picked her up from behind, and the child shrieked with the pleasure of being caught. "Not before breakfast," Clara said. "After breakfast?" Rose tried. "We'll see." "That means no," Rose said, with the resigned accuracy of a child who had learned to translate. "It means we'll see," Clara said firmly, and set her down and went to the stove, and the morning continued, imperfect and ongoing and fully inhabited. And out in the yard, Iron Ridge Ranch went on being what it had become. Not the place Clara Whitmore had been looking for when she came up the lane with cracked lips and 60 cents in her pocket. but something better than that. The place she had built. The place she had stayed to build. The difference between those two things was everything, and it had taken her the better part of a lifetime, and 4 years of open road, and one horse that gave out 3 miles east of a ranch she'd never heard of to finally understand it. She understood it now. She was home.